2,800 years ago, in the hillside villages of ancient Greece, a blind poet known as Homer produced two works that would become the foundation of Western literature. The first, the Iliad, chronicled the siege of Troy, where great heroes like Achilles and Hector fought for their survival in the most epic battle of the ancient world. It told the story of Helen, the most beautiful woman to have ever lived, and of Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, whose plan to enter the city through a giant wooden horse ultimately brought the war to an end. His second work, the Odyssey, would tell the tale of Odysseus and his journey home, where he would face horrors beyond any battlefield. Far from the grand conflict of the Iliad, this work would focus on a husband trying to return home, a father desperate to see his son, and a man using his wits to survive in a world where the gods themselves conspired against him. But what kept the cleverest man in Greece from reaching home for 10 long years? Who was the Cyclops, whose curse doomed Odysseus to wander the seas? How did he survive the Sirens, whose sweet songs no man had heard and lived to tell? Why was Odysseus compelled to descend into Hades itself and converse with the spirits of the dead? Why did the goddess Athena love him, while Poseidon, lord of the seas, wanted him dead? And throughout these trials, what of his wife, Penelope? How did she hold off over 100 suitors who invaded her home, consumed her wealth, and demanded she choose one of them to marry? I'm David Rintoul. This is Deep Dive History, and you're listening to Episode 1, The Odyssey. Prologue, The Wooden Horse. But Odysseus had never wanted to go to war. When the Greek kings summoned their allies to sail against Troy, to reclaim the Spartan queen Helen who had been stolen away, the herald who arrived at the island nation of Ithaca found its king behaving like a madman. Odysseus was ploughing his fields with salt instead of seed, yoking an ox and a donkey together and muttering nonsense to the clouds. It was the first of the many schemes he would become famous for. Odysseus had no quarrel with Troy and no desire to leave his family for a war that might last years, with him knowing that no kingdom could be asked to send a madman to battle. His wife Penelope watched from the doorway to their palace, holding their infant son Telemachus, understanding her husband's desperate scheme and sharing his determination to keep their family whole. But the herald, Palamedes, suspected this sudden madness was too convenient. To test him, Palamedes snatched baby Telemachus from his mother's arms and placed the infant directly in the path of the plough. Without hesitation, Odysseus yanked the plough aside to avoid crushing his son. In that instant, Odysseus had revealed his sanity and, caught in his own clever deception, would have no choice but to honour his oath and sail to Troy. Even in this failure, the Greeks saw that his reputation as the cleverest among them had not been exaggerated, as here was a man who had been willing to feign madness to avoid a war he knew would be long and terrible. For a decade, Odysseus fought beneath Troy's legendary walls, seemingly impregnable fortifications that had been built by the gods themselves. Every morning he would wake in the Greek camp on the beach, the salt air reminding him of Ithaca's shores, and march to battle, thinking of the son who would not recognize him, of the wife whose face grew dimmer in memory with each passing season. The goddess Athena favoured him above all others, for she saw in him a warrior who valued cunning over strength, wisdom over glory. She whispered strategies in his ear, guided his arrows to their marks. Sometimes, in the chaos of battle, he would feel her presence as a sudden clarity of thought, a perfect understanding of where to strike. Yet, even with this divine favour, the walls of Troy would not fall. Not to Achilles' fury, not to Ajax's strength, not to the 1,000 ships and their countless warriors. After 10 years of constant warfare, as both armies neared exhaustion, Odysseus sat alone on the beach one evening, watching the sun set behind the eternal walls. His mind, always turning, conceived a revolutionary new plan, one that would see the city taken without having to breach its walls at all. "We will build a horse," he told the Greek leaders that night in Agamemnon's tent. "A horse as tall as a temple, made of mountain pine and ship's timber. We will offer it as a gift to the gods, and the Trojans themselves will bring it through their gates." The construction took 3 days, the wooden beast rising 30 feet high on the beach. Its hollow belly was fitted with hidden breathing holes and a trapdoor concealed so well that even knowing it was there, it was nearly impossible to spot. On the final night, Odysseus led 29 of Greece's finest warriors up the rope ladder into the horse's belly. They carried water skins and cloths to muffle any sound. The ladder was pulled up, the trapdoor sealed from within. When dawn broke, the Trojans found the beach empty. The Greek ships were sailing away on the western horizon. Only the great horse remained, standing alone on the sand. After heated debate, after prayers and celebrations, the Trojans dragged the wooden offering through their gates. That night, as Troy celebrated its victory with wine and song, Odysseus and his men descended from the horse's belly in silence. Killing the few guards not at the celebrations, they opened the gates from within, achieving in one night what had been impossible for over a decade. As they did so, the Greek fleet, having returned under cover of darkness, poured through into the sleeping city. By dawn, Troy was a smoking ruin. Odysseus had accomplished through cunning what strength alone could not achieve. He had ended the war. As he stood at his ship's prow weeks later, watching the Anatolian coast fade into memory, Odysseus believed the worst was behind him. He had survived the war, outwitted his enemies, and was finally sailing home to Ithaca, to Penelope, and to the son who had lived his entire childhood without a father. But the gods were not finished with the man who had destroyed Troy. His journey home would take as long as the war itself. He and his crew would face creatures more terrible than any Trojan warrior. They would sail to the very edge of the world, even descend into the Underworld itself, to face the spirits of the dead. It was to be a journey so epic, so filled with wonders and horrors, that its tale would be told for thousands of years, wherever ships sail and stories are shared. This is how Odysseus, the cleverest of the Greeks, would finally come home. Part 1. Telemachus. For 20 long years, Telemachus had waited for his father to return from Troy. Every night, as the sun sank behind the western mountains, the boy would make his way down to the rocky shores of Ithaca. There, perched on the same weathered boulder where fishermen mended their nets, he would stare out into the vast expanse of water, scanning the horizon for a black-hulled ship flying Ithaca's banner. The waves would lap against the stones beneath his feet, and the salt water would sting his eyes, but still he waited, hoping to see his father's ship come over the horizon at last. Whenever a merchant vessel or fishing boat pulled into port, its hull creaking against the wooden pier, young Telemachus would rush down from the palace, his chiton billowing behind him. Before the sailors had even secured their mooring ropes, the prince would be there, breathless and eager, asking for news of the war in Troy. The weather-beaten men, their skin darkened by years under the Mediterranean sun, would look down at this earnest child with his mother's dark eyes and fine features. They would tell him tales to make his young heart race. They spoke of gods walking among mortals, of Achilles fighting the river god Scamander himself, the waters rising up in fury to drown the Greek warrior. But every time, no matter how thrilling the tale, Telemachus only wanted to hear of one man, his father, Odysseus. When the sailors realized who they were speaking to, when they saw the boy's eager expression, they would shift their stance and lower their voices. "Your father," they would say, leaning in close enough that he could smell the wine and salt fish on their breath, "your father is the cleverest man in all the Greek army." They would tell him of his heroic tales, of how Odysseus's clever schemes had saved the Greeks countless times over. Soon, however, as autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, stories began arriving from across the sea that Troy had finally fallen. The Greeks, they said, were sailing home at last, their ships heavy with Trojan gold. Telemachus, just 10 years old, felt his heart soar. He would stand on those same weathered docks from dawn until dusk, his eyes straining against the glare of the sun, as he waited to finally meet the father who he had heard so much about, but had never truly known. But soon, days stretched into weeks, and weeks ground slowly into years. Ships arrived, bearing news from every corner of the Greek world. Menelaus and Helen had made it back to Sparta, while wise Nestor had returned with his sons to sandy Pylos, where he now spent his days telling stories of the war to anyone who would listen. There was only one man who remained missing, year after year, season after season, his father, Odysseus. At first, the merchants and traders who passed through Ithaca spoke hopefully of storms and delays, of the many islands between Troy and home where a man might stop to repair his ships. But as time wore on, their tone changed. Men started whispering in the harbour taverns that the king of Ithaca was dead, that his ship had been lost in a storm, or that he had fallen prey to pirates or sea monsters. At first, Telemachus refused to believe it. He would argue with these men until his face turned red, defending his father's reputation with all the fury a boy could muster. But as the years ground on, as his voice deepened and his shoulders broadened, even Telemachus began to doubt. On those same rocks where he had kept his vigil, he would sit in silence, no longer scanning the horizon, but simply staring at the endless, empty sea. It was then that the suitors began to appear at Odysseus's palace. They came first in ones and twos, the younger sons of minor nobles, testing the waters. Each man, convinced of Odysseus's death, looked to marry his wife Penelope and claim the throne of Ithaca for themselves. They would arrive at the palace gates, dressed in their finest robes, bearing gifts of gold and ivory, making pretty speeches about protecting a widow in her time of need. Penelope, still deeply in love with her missing husband, refused to accept that Odysseus was dead. She would stay faithful to him throughout those lonely years, though the weight of maintaining this hope grew heavier with each passing season. She would reject each suitor as they came, politely but firmly, always finding some excuse or delay. But soon, what had started as a trickle turned into a flood. The sons of every important noble on the island began to arrive, and then nobles from the neighbouring islands too, all hoping to secure their place on Ithaca's throne through marriage to its queen. Before long, the palace was overrun. The suitors, numbering over 100, installed themselves in Odysseus's own halls. They stayed day and night, treating the palace as their own personal tavern. They slaughtered Odysseus's cattle and sheep for their feasts, draining amphora after amphora of his finest wine, the vintage he had been saving for his return. The great hall, which had once hosted kings and heroes, became a scene of debauchery. Their demands for Penelope to choose one of them grew more insistent by the day. They would corner her in corridors, block her path in the courtyard, their requests turning to demands. She knew that she could not resist their pressure forever. A woman alone, even a queen, had little power against so many men who recognized no authority but their own desires. Penelope, however, had developed a cunning that nearly matched even that of her missing husband. To keep the suitors at bay, she announced that she would indeed choose a new husband, but only after she had completed a sacred duty, weaving a burial shroud for Odysseus's elderly father, Laertes. It would be impious, she declared, to remarry while this duty remains unfulfilled. When old Laertes dies, he must have a shroud worthy of a king's father. Every day she would sit at her great loom in the upper chambers, her fingers working the threads with extraordinary skill. The suitors would sometimes climb the stairs to watch her work, seeing the shroud grow longer and more elaborate with each passing day, its patterns depicting scenes of heroism and glory. They grumbled at the delay, but could find no fault with her reasoning. But every night, when the palace finally grew quiet and the suitors lay drunk and snoring in the hall, Penelope would creep back to her loom by lamplight. With tears running down her cheeks, she would unpick all the progress she had made, pulling out thread after thread until the shroud was no longer than it had been that morning. For 3 years she managed to maintain this deception, the suitors too drunk and careless to notice that the shroud never seemed to be near to completion. Until, finally, inevitably, she was betrayed. One of her own maids, Melantho, who had taken one of the suitors as a lover, crept up to the chamber one night and saw her mistress at her secret work. By morning, every suitor knew of the deception. They confronted Penelope in the great hall, their faces red with rage, demanding that she choose a husband immediately or face the consequences. With her deception uncovered, Penelope was at a loss. The suitors gave her until the next harvest moon to make her choice. It appeared that she would have to pick a new husband before the year was out, condemning herself to a marriage she despised and betraying the memory of a man she still believed, against all reason, might yet return. Telemachus, meanwhile, had almost given up hope entirely. It was now 10 years since Troy had fallen, 20 years since his father had left for war. The boy himself had become a young man, tall and lean, with his father's strength beginning to show in his shoulders and arms. Yet he felt powerless. The suitors were destroying his palace, devouring his inheritance day by day like locusts in a grain field. They treated him with open contempt, pushing him aside in his own halls, mocking him when wine loosened their tongues. All hope, it seemed, was lost. Unknown to Telemachus, however, he was not the only one thinking of Odysseus's return. Far above the mortal world, up on Mount Olympus, where the stars hung close enough to touch, a great debate was playing out in the golden halls of the gods. Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, stood before her father's throne. Her grey eyes, the same colour as a storm-tossed sea, blazed with a barely contained fury. She had long held Odysseus as her favourite among all mortals. He represented everything she prized in herself: intelligence, complemented by action, cunning paired with courage. She had protected him countless times throughout the long siege of Troy, and now she would come to his aid again. "Father," she cried to Zeus, king of the gods, "has Odysseus not suffered enough? For 7 long years now he has been trapped on that cursed island of Ogygia in the middle of the endless sea, held prisoner by the nymph Calypso. He sits on the shore each day, weeping as he stares toward home, separated from all his friends and desperate to return to the family he has not seen for 20 years. She stepped closer to the throne. "Remember how he sacrificed to you on the broad plain of Troy beside the black ships? Oxen with gilded horns, the finest portions of every feast, wine poured out upon the earth in your honour. Did these sacrifices go unseen? Did the smoke not rise up to Olympus? Why do you abandon him now in his hour of greatest need?" Zeus shifted on his throne, a seat carved from a single block of marble and inlaid with gold. Lightning flickered in his beard as he considered his daughter's words. "Nonsense, my daughter," he replied. "How could I forget Odysseus? He is not only the wisest man alive, with a mind sharper than any blade, but also the most generous in his offerings to the gods. No mortal has honoured us more faithfully." He paused, his expression darkening. "No, it is not I who keeps him from home, but my brother, Poseidon, lord of all the seas. For Odysseus blinded his precious son, the mighty Cyclops, Polyphemus, driving a burning stake through his single eye, and for that crime Poseidon keeps him trapped alone in the middle of the sea, turning every wave against him, every current into an enemy." The hall fell silent for a moment. Even the minor gods and goddesses who lined the walls dared not speak. The feud between Poseidon and Odysseus was well known among the immortals, a grudge as deep as the ocean trenches themselves. "But listen here, daughter," Zeus continued, leaning forward on his throne. "Odysseus has suffered long enough. And as it happens, Poseidon is away, gone to feast with the Ethiopians at the edge of the world. Let us come up with a plan to bring the wanderer back home while my brother cannot interfere." Athena's face transformed, her stern features softening into something approaching a smile. She bowed her head slightly, a rare gesture of gratitude from the proud goddess. "Thank you, Father. Your wisdom shines like the morning star." She straightened, her mind already working through the details of her plan. "Here is what we must do. Send Hermes, the messenger, down to Ogygia to release Odysseus from his prison. All the while I will visit his son Telemachus on Ithaca and breathe courage into the boy's heart. It will give him the strength needed to stand up to those parasitic suitors who are destroying Odysseus's home. Then I will send him off to the great cities of Pylos and Sparta to learn of his father's fate from those who fought beside him at Troy. Let him build a reputation of his own, so that when Odysseus returns, he will find not a boy, but a man, ready to stand beside him." With that decided, Athena dove from Olympus, her divine form burning bright as she plummeted through the heavens towards earth. Like a falling star, she pierced the clouds, whistling past peaks where even eagles dare not fly, leaving a radiant trail of golden mist in the evening sky. The moonlit sea rushed up to meet her, and she pulled from her dive at the last moment, skimming across the silvered waves, scattering sparks of light across the water until the rocky shores of Ithaca rose before her. When she reached Odysseus's palace, she saw the depravity of the suitors firsthand. The great courtyard that had once been kept with such pride was now littered with the bones of slaughtered animals. Wine stains marked the walls like blood. Over 100 men lounged about as if they owned the place, their feet up on fine furniture, their greasy fingers pawing at the serving maids. And there, in a corner of what should have been his own hall, sat Telemachus, alone and dejected, his young face drawn with a weariness that belonged to a much older man. The goddess paused at the threshold, considering her approach. Then, in a shimmer of light, she transformed herself. Her divine radiance faded, her armour melted away, and in her place stood Mentes, an old family friend of Odysseus, a sea captain from Taphos, whom the family had not seen for years. She wore the simple woolen cloak of a traveller, carried a bronze-tipped spear, and bore the rugged look of one who had spent many years sailing the trade routes. She approached the boy, who, despite his depressed state, noticed the stranger immediately. Telemachus rose to his feet, and, to Athena's pleasure, he welcomed her into the palace with perfect courtesy. He offered her food and shelter, as the sacred laws of hospitality demanded, leading her to a seat far from the noise of the suitors, bringing water for her hands in a golden pitcher, then setting before her the best cuts of meat and the finest wine in the house. His manners immediately impressed the goddess, showing that his father's virtues lived on in him, despite everything. As they ate and drank together, Athena spoke to him of Odysseus. "You have grown handsome, young prince," she said, her voice carrying the gruff tones of the old sea captain. "The gods have been generous with their gifts. You have your mother's quiet dignity, but I see your father in your careful movements, in the way you observe before you act. Odysseus had that same look when he was young, before Troy called him away." But as they continued to talk, the peaceful moment was shattered by a roar of drunken laughter. One of the suitors had grabbed a serving-maid, pulling her onto his lap despite her protests. Another was throwing bones at a cowering dog. Athena's eyes, even in her mortal disguise, flashed with divine anger. She turned to Telemachus, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "These men are a disgrace," she said. "They disrespect the gods themselves by violating the sacred laws of hospitality. They consume what is not theirs. They abuse those under this roof's protection. They turn a noble house into a common tavern. No self-respecting man would tolerate this. You must find your father, young prince. You must bring Odysseus home at once to deal with these suitors before they devour everything he built, before they force your mother into a marriage that would destroy her." Telemachus looked at the old captain, hope and despair warring in his young face. "I agree," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I have no idea what to do. I am only one man, barely tested in battle. They are over 100, many of them trained warriors. And my father, if he still lives, I do not know where to find him. The sea is vast, and I am just one young man with no ship, no crew, and no knowledge of where to begin." The goddess, disguised as Mentes, leaned forward, and for a moment Telemachus could have sworn he saw something else in those eyes, something ancient and powerful. "Listen well, young prince," she said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed strange coming from the weathered sea captain. "Tomorrow you must call an assembly. Summon every man of Ithaca to the harbour, where your father once held court beneath the old olive tree. Stand before them, with the morning sun at your back, and speak with the voice of a king's son." She grasped his shoulders, and Telemachus felt an unusual strength flow into him. "Tell the suitors publicly what they already know in their hearts, that they violate every law sacred to gods and men. Command them to return to their own homes, to seek their wives elsewhere. Let all of Ithaca bear witness to their shame." "But they will not listen," Telemachus protested, though already he felt something changing within him, a spark catching flame. "No," agreed the disguised goddess, "they will not. But the gods will hear, and the people will remember. After the assembly you must act swiftly. Find a ship, gather 20 trustworthy seamen, sail first for Pylos, where aged Nestor lives. He fought beside your father at Troy and may have news. From there continue to Sparta, to the palace of Menelaus and Helen. They were the last to leave Troy's shores and might know your father's fate." With that, Mentes moved toward the door. Telemachus rose to escort his guest, but in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the figure vanished. Where the old sea captain had stood, an eagle suddenly soared upward, its great wings casting shadows across the courtyard. The serving women cried out in amazement, and even some of the drunken suitors looked up in bewilderment. Telemachus stood transfixed. This had been no ordinary visitor, but one of the immortals themselves, come down from Olympus to guide him. The knowledge filled him with a courage he had never known. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and for the first time in years, he looked like what he was, the son of Odysseus. That night, Telemachus barely slept. He lay on his bed, listening to the suitors' drunken songs echoing through the halls, planning what he would say when dawn came. When the first light crept across the eastern horizon, he rose and dressed in his finest tunic, one his mother had woven with her own hands. He strapped on his bronze sword, threw a cloak across his shoulders, and strode down to the harbour. The heralds went through the town at his command, calling every free man to assembly. By the time the sun had finally risen, the gathering place by the harbour was crowded. Old men who remembered Odysseus came leaning on their staffs. Fishermen left their nets. Farmers walked in from their fields. Even the suitors came, curious about what the boy had to say. Telemachus took his place at the centre of the assembly, standing beneath the ancient olive tree where his father had once dispensed justice. In his hand he held the speaker's staff, its polished wood worn smooth by generations of hands. The crowd fell silent, waiting. For a moment the young prince felt the weight of all those eyes upon him, and his voice caught in his throat. Then he remembered the eagle, the divine visitor in his hall, and strength flowed back into his limbs. "Men of Ithaca," he began, his voice carrying across the assembly with surprising force. 20 years ago my father sailed with your sons and brothers to Troy. Of all those who left, only he has not returned. We do not know if my father Odysseus lives or has perished somewhere on the vast sea, but I know this: what happens in his house brings shame upon our island." A murmur ran through the crowd. The suitors shifted restlessly, their hands moving to their sword hilts, but Telemachus continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "These men," he said, gesturing towards the suitors, "have invaded my father's house like a plague. They feast on his cattle, drink his wine, and pursue my mother with shameless persistence. They consume in a day what should sustain a household for a month. They treat servant women as their playthings. They respect neither the gods above nor the laws of men below." Antinous, the most arrogant of the suitors, pushed forward through the crowd. He was a tall man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth. "Bold words for a beardless boy," he sneered. "Your mother has deceived us for 3 years with her weaving trick. If anyone brings shame here, it is Penelope, who promises to choose a husband, yet refuses to do so. Send your mother back to her father's house. Let her marry whomever he commands. Until then, we stay." Another suitor, Eurymachus, well-spoken and deceptive, stepped forward. "Come now, young Telemachus, we mean no true harm. We simply court your mother, as is our right. Any noble woman left so long without a husband must remarry. It is the way of things. Your father is surely dead. Accept this truth, and perhaps we can come to an arrangement. Choose one of us as your stepfather, and we will ensure you keep some small portion of your inheritance." The crowd murmured uneasily. Many thought Eurymachus spoke sense, though they feared to say so aloud. But Telemachus stood firm, the morning sun bright on his face, looking so much like his father for a moment that several of the old men gasped. "I will seek news of my father," he declared. "I sail tomorrow for Pylos and Sparta. If I learn that Odysseus truly is dead, then my mother will choose her fate. But if he lives, if there is even a chance he might return home, then I swear by Zeus himself that every man who has dishonoured his house will face his wrath." With that, he cast down the speaker's staff and strode from the assembly, leaving the crowd in shock. The suitors laughed uneasily among themselves, but something had changed. The boy they had dismissed and ignored for years had finally shown himself to be his father's son. Part 2. The boy becomes a man. That evening, as the suitors returned to their feasting, Telemachus made his way down to the harbour alone. The old fishermen had long since pulled their boats onto the beach, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of waves against weathered wood. He stood there in the gathering darkness, wondering how he would find a ship and crew brave enough to follow him. "Prince Telemachus," a voice whispered from the shadows. A figure emerged, tall and strong, with grey eyes that seemed familiar, though Telemachus could not place them. It was Mentor, his father's old friend, who had been left in charge of the household years ago, though age had somehow not touched him as it should have. In truth, this was Athena once more, taking another mortal form to aid the young prince. "Your ship awaits," Mentor said, gesturing towards the harbour's edge where a sleek vessel sat ready, its black hull fresh with pitch, its sail furled and waiting. 20 good men from the outlying farms, loyal to your father's memory, have gathered to row you to Pylos. They wait only for your word." Telemachus stared in amazement. Earlier that day there had been no such ship, no such crew. Yet here they were, provisions already loaded, water jars secured, everything prepared for a journey across the open sea. A sailor beckoned him aboard, and Telemachus stepped onto the deck, his heart racing with anticipation. The crew took their positions at the oars. They pushed off as the full moon rose above the mountains of Ithaca. Athena, still in Mentor's form, stood at the stern and called upon the west wind, who came rushing down from the hills, filling their sail with his breath. All through the night they sailed, the stars wheeling overhead until the coast of Pylos came into view. The city was already awake, for this was a holy day, and King Nestor was sacrificing to Poseidon on the beach. Telemachus felt his courage falter as their ship ground onto the shore. Here was Nestor, the oldest and wisest of all who had fought at Troy, a man who had seen 3 generations of heroes rise and fall. How could he, an untested youth, approach such a legend? "Come," said Mentor, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "The old king values courtesy above all things. Speak truthfully, and he will help you." They walked up the beach towards where Nestor sat on a polished stone, his white beard flowing to his chest, his sons arranged around him like pillars supporting an ancient temple. Despite his 90 years, the old king's eyes were still sharp as a hawk's, and they fixed immediately upon the strangers approaching. "Welcome, friends!" Nestor called out before they had even reached him, his voice still strong despite his age. "Come, share our feast, and when you have eaten your fill, tell us who you are and what brings you to sandy Pylos." They sat on fleeces spread upon the sand, and ate the roasted meat, rich with fat that dripped onto the coals. When the meal was done and wine had been poured to the gods, Nestor turned to his guests with an expectant smile. "I am Telemachus," the young man said, "son of Odysseus, who ruled Ithaca before the black ships carried him to Troy. I seek news of my father. You fought beside him on the plains before those towering walls. Tell me, please, when did you last see him? Do you know his fate?" The old king's face grew sad, and he was silent for a long moment, his eyes seeing not the beach before him, but battlefields 10 years gone. "Ah, your father," he said at last, his voice heavy with memory. "The cleverest of us all, and perhaps for that reason the most cursed. We suffered 9 long years before Troy's walls, young prince. Your father's strategies saved us more times than I can count. When Achilles sulked in his tent, it was Odysseus who held the army together. When we needed to steal the Palladium from Troy's temple, it was Odysseus who crept through the darkness to seize it." Nestor paused, accepting a cup of wine from one of his sons. "But after Troy fell, after we had burned that great city to ash and divided its treasures, the gods in their anger scattered us like leaves before a storm. Your father and I quarrelled, I'm ashamed to say, about when to sail for home. I left immediately with my ships, while he remained with Agamemnon to make further sacrifices, hoping to appease Athena's wrath." The old king shook his head slowly. "That was the last time I saw Odysseus, standing on the beach at Troy. Since then I have heard nothing certain of his fate. Some ships, I know, were scattered by storms, others fell prey to misfortune on their journeys home. But of your father's path across the sea I can tell you nothing, for no word has reached me these 10 long years." He grasped Telemachus's hand with fingers still strong despite their age. "But this I know for certain. If any man could survive whatever trials the gods have set before him, it would be your father. Never have I seen Athena favour any mortal as she favoured him. If she still watches over him, as I believe she must, then there is hope yet. The gods do not abandon those they love without purpose." The next morning, Telemachus, emboldened by the old king's words, set out for Sparta, home of Menelaus and Helen. Upon his arrival he found the palace in celebration, for Menelaus was marrying off both his son and daughter on the same day. The courtyard was full of dancers, whirling to the sound of lyres, acrobats leaping through hoops of fire, and tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats and honeyed cakes. Menelaus himself sat in the centre of it all, still powerful despite the grey in his famous red hair, his broad shoulders draped in a purple cloak worth a king's ransom. Beside him sat Helen, and Telemachus found himself unable to look away. 10 years had passed since she had returned from Troy, yet she seemed untouched by time, her beauty still capable of stopping conversations mid-word. There was something otherworldly about her, as if she were not quite mortal, not quite present, her beauty so absolute that men forgot to breathe when she turned their way. "More guests!" Menelaus called out warmly when he saw Telemachus approach. "Come and join our feast. There is meat and wine enough for all of Sparta, and more besides." The young man was bathed in a silver basin and given a fresh tunic of the finest Egyptian linen. Only after, when he had eaten his fill, did Menelaus lean forward, his keen eyes studying Telemachus's face with growing recognition. "You have the look of someone I once knew," the king said slowly. "The set of your jaw, the way you hold your head. If I did not know better, I would say you were the very image of my clever friend Odysseus." At the mention of his father's name, Telemachus could not stop the tears that suddenly burned his eyes. He tried to hide them, raising his cloak, but Helen saw it all. She rose from her seat and mixed wine in a golden bowl, adding to it a drug from Egypt that had the power to banish sorrow and anger, to make men forget their troubles for a time. "Drink," she said, her voice soft and measured. "Then let us speak of your father without tears, for he deserves better than sorrow." When they had drunk the enchanted wine and felt its warmth spread through their limbs, Menelaus began his tale. "Your father," he said, leaning back in his chair, "saved my life more times than I can count. But the last news I had of him came from an unexpected source." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "When we were returning from Troy, my ships were trapped for 20 days on the island of Pharos, off the coast of Egypt. The winds had died completely, and we were running out of food and water." The king's voice dropped lower, drawing his listeners in. "In desperation, I ambushed Proteus, the old man of the sea, the shape-shifting prophet who knows all things that were, that are, and that are yet to come. I held him fast as he transformed from seal to lion, from serpent to tree, from running water to raging fire. But I did not let go, and finally he resumed his true form and agreed to answer my questions." Menelaus looked directly at Telemachus. "I asked about all our companions who had not returned home. Most, he told me, were dead. Agamemnon murdered by his wife, Ajax drowned by Poseidon's hand, but your father, he said, lived still. Proteus saw him on the island of Ogygia, in the halls of the nymph Calypso, daughter of Atlas, who holds up the sky. She keeps him there against his will, where he has no ship or crew to carry him home. Every day he sits on the shore, weeping as he looks toward Ithaca, but the nymph will not release him." Telemachus felt his heart race. His father lived, trapped, yes, but alive. "How long ago was this?" he asked urgently. 7 years past," Menelaus admitted. "But if Calypso holds him still, she holds him for a reason. The immortals do not easily give up what they claim as their own." That night, as Telemachus lay in bed, his mind churned with all he had learned. His father lived, but was imprisoned by a goddess. The suitors grew bolder by the day. Time was running short. He needed to return to Ithaca, but what could one young man do against divine will? As if reading his thoughts, that night, as Telemachus lay in bed planning his return, Athena appeared beside him, no longer disguised, but shining with her full divine radiance. "Take heart, young prince," she said. "Even now, my father Zeus sends Hermes to Ogygia to command Calypso to release your father. Odysseus will soon be free to attempt his journey home, but the sea is wide and Poseidon's anger runs deep. Your father's journey will be perilous, and he will need a strong son waiting when he arrives. Return to Ithaca. Prepare for what must come." When dawn came the next day, Telemachus rose and prepared to leave. Menelaus tried to persuade him to stay longer, offering gifts of horses and chariots, but the young prince would accept only what he could carry on a ship, knowing that time was now his enemy. As their chariot rolled away from Sparta's golden palace, an eagle suddenly swooped from the mountain, carrying in its talons a white goose stolen from the palace grounds. Helen, who had come to see them off, clapped her hands in delight. "A sign!" she cried. "Just as that wild eagle descended to take the goose, so will Odysseus return from his wanderings to take vengeance on those who feast in his halls. Mark my words, young prince. Your father comes home, and blood will flow when he arrives." With Helen's words filling him with hope, Telemachus set off and journeyed towards the coast, toward his ship, toward home. He had learned what he had come to learn. His father lived. The gods themselves were working to free him. And when Odysseus returned to Ithaca, he would not find a boy waiting, but a man ready to stand beside him, ready to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Part 3. Calypso. 10 years had passed since Troy fell. Of the 12 ships that had sailed from Ithaca, all were lost. Of the hundreds of men who had called him captain, all were dead. Now in the 10th year of his wanderings, Odysseus found himself trapped on an island at the very edge of the world, neither dead nor truly alive, held captive by a goddess who loved him. The island of Ogygia rose high from the sea, surrounded by waters so deep they appeared black even at noon, its surface thickly forested with cypress and alder trees. 4 clear water springs flowed from a central cave, and wildflowers grew in the meadows below. For any other man, it would have been paradise, but for Odysseus, it was prison. In the great cave that served as both a palace and a bedchamber lived Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas, who holds the heavens on his shoulders. She was beautiful beyond mortal description, with golden hair and a voice carrying the power of the sea. She had found Odysseus years before, washed up on her shores, the sole survivor of his last shipwreck, clinging to a piece of broken mast. She had nursed him back to health, fed him ambrosia and nectar, the food of the gods, and fallen deeply in love with the clever mortal who told such wonderful stories of the world beyond her island. But Odysseus, though he shared her bed each night, though he lived in comfort no mortal king could match, spent his days sitting on the rocky shore, staring east toward a home he could not see. Seawater mixed with his tears as he watched the empty horizon, searching for any sail, any sign that he was not forgotten by the world. Calypso would find him there each evening, his clothes soaked and his eyes red from weeping. "My love," she would say, her immortal hand on his shoulder, "why do you grieve? I offer you immortality itself. Stay with me and you will never age, never die. We will live here forever, beyond the reach of both fate and suffering." But Odysseus would only shake his head, his voice woeful when he replied, "Lady, you are more beautiful than any mortal woman, more gracious than my wife could ever be. Yet I would rather die attempting to reach Ithaca than live forever without seeing my home again. My son was a baby when I left. He would be a man now if he lives. My wife, Penelope, surely believes me dead. My father, old Laertes, may have already passed to the underworld, never knowing what became of his son." For 7 years this scene repeated itself. 7 years of golden days and lonely nights. Calypso's island provided everything except the one thing Odysseus truly wanted: a way home. But the gods, who had been silent for so long, finally took notice. Under Zeus's command, Hermes, messenger of the gods, flew to Ogygia's distant shores to deliver his message to Calypso. He found the nymph in her cave, weaving at her golden loom, singing in a voice that could charm the winds to stillness. When she saw Hermes at her threshold, his winged sandals still glowing after his flight, her immortal heart sank. Gods did not visit one another without purpose, and Hermes' expression told her this was no social call. "Calypso," Hermes said, accepting the nectar she offered him, as was custom between the immortals, "I bring word from Zeus. You must release Odysseus. Help him build a raft, provision him for the journey, and send him on his way. It is decreed that he will reach the land of the Phaeacians, who will honour him and send him home to Ithaca with gifts greater than any he would have won from Troy." Rage swept across Calypso's features. "You gods are cruel in your jealousy. Zeus himself has fathered countless children with mortal women. Poseidon beds whom he pleases across the earth and sea. But you cannot bear to see a goddess love a mortal man. When Dawn took Orion as her lover, you struck him down with Artemis's arrows. When Demeter lay with Iasion, Zeus killed him with a thunderbolt. Now you would take Odysseus from me, though I saved him from death, though I offered him immortality itself." But her protests were hollow, and she knew it. One does not defy Zeus and survive, not even an immortal. When Hermes departed that afternoon, Calypso went to find Odysseus at his usual spot on the shore. "Your wait is over, Odysseus," she said, though her voice broke with grief. "Your prayers have been heard. Tomorrow you will begin building a raft, and I will help you. You will leave this island to make your way home at last." Odysseus, after so many years of disappointment, could barely believe her words. He searched her face for deception, wondering if this were some new torment. "Lady, surely this is a trick. How can a mortal cross the vast sea on a raft? Even ships with 20 oarsmen fear these waters." Calypso swore an oath by the river Styx, the most binding oath any immortal can make, that she meant him no harm. Only then did Odysseus allow himself to hope. For 4 days he laboured with the tools Calypso provided. He felled 20 trees, tall alders and pines that would resist the salt water. He shaped them with an axe and fitted them together with skills learned long ago in Ithaca. On the 5th day, Calypso brought him to the raft, now loaded with supplies. She had prepared everything he would need: skins filled with wine and water, bags of grain and preserved meats to last for weeks. Finally, she taught him to navigate by the stars. "Keep the bear always on your left," she instructed, her immortal fingers tracing the constellations in the brightening sky. "Sail for 17 days, and on the 18th you will see the mountains of the Phaeacian coast." As Odysseus prepared to push off, Calypso embraced him one last time, her tears falling on his weathered neck. "I know your heart was never mine," she whispered, "but remember me, the goddess who loved you." Then Odysseus pushed his raft into the waves. The sail filled out with wind sent by Calypso herself, with his small raft carrying him away from paradise and toward the unknown. Behind him, Calypso stood on the shore, her golden form growing smaller until she was just a glimmer on a distant island that would soon vanish below the horizon. For 17 days, everything went as Calypso had promised. The winds were steady and the sea calm. Odysseus barely slept, his hand always on the steering oar, his eyes fixed on the bare constellation wheeling overhead. Dolphins raced alongside his raft, and seabirds circled overhead. On the morning of the 18th day, just as the goddess had predicted, he saw mountains rising from the sea, the land of the Phaeacians finally in sight. But Poseidon, travelling back from his Ethiopian feast, soon spotted the small raft sailing through his vast domain. The earth-shaker's rage erupted when he realized Odysseus had escaped Calypso's island. "So!" the god roared, his voice making the seas tremble. "The other gods conspire while I am away. They would let this mortal reach safety after he blinded my son? Never! Zeus may have decreed that he will survive, but I can still make him suffer." Poseidon gathered the storm clouds with his massive trident, stirring the sea into chaos. The winds attacked from every direction at once. The east wind fought the south wind, the west wind battled the north. Waves, tall as mountains, crashed over Odysseus's raft, tossing it around like driftwood. The sail tore away with a terrible sound. Then came a groan from deep within the mast itself, a sound that grew louder and louder until, crack! The mast snapped and fell into the churning waters. The steering oar was ripped from his hands. All around him was the deafening chaos of the storm, wind that shrieked like the Furies themselves, and waves that boomed like war drums. A great current then lifted the raft toward the sky before smashing it down into the frothing waters. The logs, so carefully fitted, were torn apart. Odysseus was thrown into the sea, pulled down by his waterlogged clothing, the gifts from Calypso now threatening to drown him. He fought to the surface, gasping, only to see another mountain of water descending. He clung to a single log from his destroyed raft as waves tried to tear him loose. Salt burned his eyes and throat. His fingers, torn and bleeding, could barely maintain their grip. Several times he went under, sure that this was his end, only to burst back to the surface. But the fates had declared he would not die at sea. The sea goddess Ino, who had once been mortal and knew the terror of drowning, took pity on him. She appeared to him in the form of a sea-bird, landing on his log long enough to speak. "Poor Odysseus," she said, her voice somehow clear despite the howling wind. "Poseidon seeks your death, but cannot achieve it. Take this immortal veil, tie it around your chest. It will not let you drown. Swim for the Phaeacian shore. When you reach land, throw it back into the sea." With that, she gave him a shimmering veil, light but strong, then dove back into the waves. Odysseus, though suspicious of gifts from the immortals, had no choice. Another massive wave shattered his log, and he tied the veil around his chest and began to swim. For 2 more days he swam through the gradually calming waters, with Poseidon's rage finally spent. On the morning of the 3rd day, as he was near to passing out from exhaustion, the rocky coast of Scheria, homeland of the Phaeacians, finally came into view. But the coastline offered no beach, only ragged cliffs that threatened to tear him apart. He swam along the shore, his strength nearly gone, until finally he spotted the mouth of a river. "River god," he prayed, his voice barely a whisper, "whoever you are, I come to you for rescue. Pity a man who has suffered much." The river heard him and stilled its current, smoothing its waters to let him swim upstream. Odysseus dragged himself onto the muddy bank, every muscle aching. He untied Ino's veil and threw it back into the water with a prayer of thanks. Then, naked, exhausted, and caked with salt, he crawled into a grove of olive trees. He covered himself with fallen leaves, hundreds of them, until he had made a nest. There, hidden from sight, barely clinging to life, Odysseus fell into the deepest sleep of his life. Part 4. The Phaeacians. The island of Scheria was home to the Phaeacians, a people blessed by the gods who enjoyed plentiful harvests and had an expert knowledge of sailing. They were ruled by King Alcinous and his wise queen Arete, whose counsel the king sought in all matters of importance. The day after Odysseus's arrival, the gods set events in motion. Athena, seeking to aid Odysseus further, appeared in the dreams of Princess Nausicaa, daughter of Alcinous and Arete, taking the form of her closest friend. "Nausicaa," the goddess whispered, "your wedding clothes lie unwashed. How will you ever hope to marry with dusty linens? Go to the river tomorrow with your maids. Take the mule cart and wash everything clean." When dawn came, Nausicaa woke with the dream fresh in her mind. She gathered her handmaids, young women who giggled and sang as they loaded the cart with dirty clothes, olive oil for washing, and food for their midday meal. They drove the mules along the coastal path to where the river met the sea, where stone basins had been carved by generations of Phaeacian women for washing clothes. The girls worked through the morning, treading the clothes in the clear water, spreading them on the smooth rocks to dry in the sun. When their work was done, they bathed in the river and rubbed themselves with olive oil until their skin gleamed. They ate their meal on the riverbank, then began to play, tossing a leather ball back and forth, their laughter carrying on the sea breeze. But one throw went wild. The ball splashed into the water near a grove of olive trees, causing the girls to shriek in shock. Their cries woke Odysseus from his death-like sleep beneath the leaves. He stirred, confused, his body still caked with salt, his mind slowly remembering the storm, the swimming, the terrible exhaustion. Hearing female voices, he faced a dilemma. He was naked, covered only in dried mud and leaves, yet he desperately needed help. Breaking off a leafy branch to cover himself, Odysseus emerged from the grove like some wild creature of the forest. His hair was matted with brine, his skin was raw from salt water, his eyes were bloodshot from his ordeal. The sight of him sent the handmaids running down the beach, screaming in terror at this apparition from the woods. But Nausicaa stood her ground. Athena had given her the courage to stand firm. As Odysseus approached, he stopped at a respectful distance, holding his branch, and spoke with the persuasive voice that had once swayed warriors and kings. "Princess," he began, his voice hoarse, "are you a goddess or a mortal? If you are a goddess, you must be Artemis herself, so tall and beautiful you stand. If you are a mortal, then your parents are blessed to have such a daughter. I am a shipwrecked wanderer, cast up on your shores after 20 days at sea. I know no one in this land. I beg you for help, for some rag to cover myself, and directions to your city. And may the gods grant you everything your heart desires, a good husband, a happy home, and, most importantly, a marriage where you truly understand each other. Nothing could be better than that." Nausicaa, though young, recognized the refined speech of a nobleman despite his wretched appearance. "Stranger," she replied, "you seem neither evil nor foolish. Since you've come to our land, you won't lack for clothes or anything else we owe a traveller in need. This is the country of the Phaeacians, and I am the daughter of Alcinous, our king." She called her frightened maids back, scolding them gently. "This man is a shipwrecked wanderer. All strangers and beggars come from Zeus, and even a small gift is welcome. Give him food and drink, and let him bathe in the river where there's shelter from the wind." The maids brought Odysseus a tunic and cloak from the clean laundry, and a flask of golden olive oil. They showed him a sheltered spot in the river, then withdrew while he washed away the salt crust from his skin and hair. When he emerged, clean and dressed, Athena made him appear taller and more handsome, his dark hair restored to its natural curl. The transformation was so complete that when Nausicaa saw him, she whispered to her maids, "When he first appeared, he looked absolutely terrible. Now he looks like one of the gods themselves." Nausicaa gave him food and wine, which Odysseus consumed with the desperation of a man who had not eaten properly in days. Then, as the sun began to descend toward the western horizon, she prepared to lead him to the city. But, being a princess, she was careful to maintain appearances. "Stranger," she said, "follow my cart to the city, but when we reach the outskirts, wait in the sacred grove of Athena you'll find there. Let me go ahead to my father's house. We Phaeacians are proud and quick to gossip, and I would not have them saying I brought home a husband from the beach. When enough time has passed for me to reach the palace, enter the city and ask for King Alcinous's house. Anyone can direct you, even a child, for there is no other house like it. When you enter, go straight through the great hall to my mother. You'll find her sitting by the hearth in the firelight. Clasp her knees as a suppliant. If she looks upon you with kindness, you will see your homeland again." With that, she drove the mule cart toward the city, her maids walking alongside, while Odysseus followed at a distance. When they reached the grove of Athena, he stopped and prayed to the goddess, while Nausicaa continued home. As dusk fell, he made his way into the city, where Athena shrouded him in mist, so no one would challenge or question him. The palace of Alcinous was magnificent beyond anything Odysseus had seen since leaving Troy. The walls were bronze, from threshold to innermost chamber, with a frieze of blue enamel running around them. Golden and silver dogs, crafted by the god Hephaestus himself, stood guard on either side of the entrance, while inside 50 golden torch holders shaped like young men held burning torches to light the feasts. Odysseus walked through the hall, still invisible in Athena's mist, marvelling at the wealth and beauty around him. The Phaeacian nobles sat at their evening meal, pouring libations to Hermes as they talked among each other. When he reached the hearth, the mist suddenly dissolved, and Odysseus appeared before them, his hands clasping Queen Arete's knees in the traditional gesture of supplication. "Queen Arete," he said, "I come to your knees and to your husband after much suffering. May the gods grant all of you happiness, and may you pass on your prosperity to your children. But please, give me an escort to my homeland quickly, for I have been kept from my family too long, suffering hardships no man should be forced to endure." The hall fell silent at this sudden appearance. Then Echeneus, the oldest of the Phaeacian nobles, spoke. "Alcinous, it is not fitting that a stranger sits in the ashes by your hearth. Raise him up and seat him properly." King Alcinous took Odysseus by the hand and raised him from the hearth, seating him on a silver-studded chair beside his own. Servants brought water for his hands and food for his table. When he had eaten and drunk, Alcinous addressed the assembled nobles. "Tomorrow we shall feast this stranger properly and arrange his passage home, wherever that may be, but tonight let him rest." The nobles agreed and departed to their homes, leaving Odysseus with the king and queen. Arete, studying the clothes Odysseus wore, recognized them as her own handiwork. "Stranger," she said, "who are you, and where do you come from? Who gave you those clothes? Did you not say you came here wandering over the sea?" Odysseus, careful not to reveal his identity yet, told them he had come from the island of Ogygia, where he had been held against his will. He described the storm that had destroyed his raft and how he had washed up on their shore, before meeting Nausicaa by the river. He spoke warmly of the princess's kindness and good judgment, to the delight of her parents. "Tomorrow," Alcinous declared, "we shall feast in your honour. Then our finest crew will row you home in one of our swift ships. They can reach any destination in a single day, so skillfully do they navigate the seas." The next day dawned bright over Scheria. Heralds went through the city announcing a feast for the mysterious stranger. The Phaeacians, always eager for entertainment and stories of distant lands, gathered in great numbers at the palace. Alcinous sacrificed 12 sheep, 8 boars, and 2 oxen for the feast. The meat roasted over great fires, while servants mixed wine in silver bowls. As the feast began, Demodocus, the poet, was led into the hall. The Muses, the 9 goddesses who inspire all art and song, had given him a precious gift. They had taken his eyesight, but granted him extraordinary skill in music and poetry. He sat on his silver-studded chair, his lyre hanging on a peg above his head where he could reach it easily. When the feasting was done, he took down the instrument and began to sing. His first song told of a quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles at Troy, how the 2 greatest Greek warriors had exchanged harsh words at a feast, and how Agamemnon had rejoiced secretly, remembering a prophecy that Troy would fall when the best of the Greeks quarrelled among themselves. As Demodocus sang, Odysseus pulled his purple cloak over his head and wept, as he remembered all the friends he had lost. He tried to hide his tears from the crowd, but Alcinous, seated next to him, saw his distress and quickly called for dancing and a different song. Demodocus switched to a lighter tale, the story of how Hephaestus trapped his cheating wife Aphrodite with her lover Ares in golden chains. The crowd roared with laughter as he continued to sing, the mood in the hall having completely transformed. After the feast, when the wine had been flowing freely, Odysseus approached Demodocus. "Demodocus," he said, "you're the finest poet I've ever heard. You must be divinely inspired to sing so truthfully about the Greeks' fate. Now tell us about the wooden horse built with Athena's guidance, the trick that Odysseus used to smuggle warriors into Troy itself." The blind poet smiled and struck his lyre. He sang of how the Greeks had burned their camp and sailed away, while their best warriors hid in the horse's hollow belly. He sang of the Trojans debating whether to smash the wooden horse, throw it from the cliffs, or dedicate it to the gods. He sang of how the Greeks poured out in the night, and how Athena granted them victory in that terrible battle. As the poet sang, Odysseus wept openly now, his tears flowing as he heard his own story. Alcinous, seeing his guest's uncontrollable grief, raised his hand to stop the singing. "Demodocus, hold your song. Our guest does not enjoy this tale as we do. Since you began singing of Troy, he has not stopped weeping." The king turned to Odysseus. "But you, honoured guest, it is time to tell us truly. What is your name? What city do you come from? Where should our ships carry you? And why do you weep so bitterly when you hear of Troy's fate? Did you lose a kinsman there, a son or a brother, or perhaps a beloved companion?" The hall fell silent. Every face turned toward the mysterious stranger. Odysseus wiped his eyes, straightened his shoulders, and spoke at last with his true voice, the voice that had commanded 1,000 warriors. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, famous throughout the world for my cunning. My home is Ithaca, a small rocky island in the western sea that means everything to me. I've spent 10 years trying to return." A gasp ran through the hall. This was Odysseus himself, the architect of Troy's destruction, the cleverest of all the Greeks, sitting at their table. "Since leaving Troy's burning towers, I have wandered seas no Greek has sailed before, seen horrors beyond mortal imagination, lost every one of my faithful companions to monsters, storms, and divine wrath. Every attempt to reach my homeland has ended in tragedy, each disaster worse than the last." He looked around the silent hall, at the faces of those who stared back at him. "But you ask for my story," he said, settling back in his chair, accepting the wine cup a servant offered. "Then I will tell it all, from the day we sailed from Troy to the moment I washed up naked and alone on your shore. Listen, then, to the tale of my wanderings, and judge for yourselves whether any man has suffered more at the hands of the gods." Part 5. Lost at Sea. As Odysseus began his story in the great hall of Alcinous, the torches flickering against the stone walls, he recalled back to the last days of the Trojan War, 10 years prior. His 12 black ships sat low in the water, their hollow hulls loaded with Trojan gold looted from the city. His men, tired after a decade of war, yearned for nothing more than to feel Ithacan soil beneath their feet once more. The warriors sang as they pushed the ships into the surf, their voices carrying across the water a song of homecoming after 10 long years. They would first head north along the Thracian coast to look for supplies. Their stores were running low, the grain sacks nearly empty after the final weeks of the siege. After 2 days of sailing, they landed on the shores of Ismara. This was the home of the Ciconians, a fierce Thracian tribe who had sent warriors to fight alongside the Trojans, their cavalry famous throughout the region for their skill with both the spear and the bow. The raid began at dawn. Odysseus and his men swept through the city, overwhelming the drowsy sentries before they could raise an alarm. They gathered the supplies they desperately needed, loading their ships with amphoras of wine, sacks of barley, and fresh water from the city's wells. But Odysseus, knowing speed was essential, urged his men to leave quickly, to take what they needed and depart before the Ciconians could mount a counterattack. His words fell on deaf ears. The men, drunk on victory and Ciconian wine, refused to listen. They slaughtered cattle on the beach, roasting the meat over makeshift fires while passing wineskins from hand to hand. As the sun climbed higher and the shadows grew short, Odysseus watched the hills with growing unease. His fears proved justified. By afternoon, the surviving Ciconians had gathered their neighbours from the inland settlements, assembling a force that outnumbered the Greeks 5-1. The battle was fierce but brief. Spears clashed against shields, and the beach ran red with blood. 6 men from each of Odysseus's ships fell to the Ciconian assault, their bodies left behind in the hasty retreat as the Greeks fought their way back to their vessels. They pushed off from the blood-stained shore, with Ciconian arrows still whistling overhead, splashing into the water around the ships as they made their escape. With their first landing already having turned to disaster, they sailed away in silence. Only when they were safely offshore did they break it, calling out the names of each dead companion 3 times, an ancient custom meant to ensure the souls could find their way to Hades despite their bodies lying unburied on foreign sand. Heading south, they would sail round the familiar shores of Greece, past headlands they knew by name and islands where they had stopped in happier times. The men spoke excitedly of home as they passed Euboea's long coastline, of wives they had not seen in a decade, and children who would not recognize their fathers' faces. They sailed through the night when the weather was fair, navigating by the stars that Greek sailors had used for generations. Then finally they turned north towards Ithaca, towards home. But as they neared those beloved shores, when they could almost see the fishing huts dotting the beaches, Zeus himself intervened. A great storm erupted from a clear sky, the kind of tempest that only the gods can summon. In moments their sails were gone, ripped away into the darkness. The ships groaned and cracked under the assault of waves that came from every angle, water flooding the decks faster than the men could handle. For 9 days and nights the storm raged without mercy. The men could do nothing but bail water and pray, clinging to the rigging as their ships were driven far from any course they knew. When the 10th day finally brought calm seas, they found themselves in waters no Greek had sailed before, approaching an island shrouded in mist, where strange white flowers grew down to the water's edge. Part 6. The Island of the Lotus Eaters. Lost and confused, with no stars they recognized in the foreign sky above them, Odysseus and his crew would drag their battered ships onto the island's sandy shore. The beach was unnaturally quiet, with no sound of seabirds or the breaking of waves, only a heavy, sweet fragrance that hung in the air like incense in a temple. The men stumbled from their ships on unsteady legs, their throats parched from days of drinking only the salty water they had managed to collect during the storm. They had not walked far inland when they encountered the island's inhabitants emerging from groves of strange trees. These people moved with an odd, dreamlike slowness, their faces bearing peaceful smiles that never seemed to change. Their clothes were simple white robes, stained purple at the edges from some unknown liquid. When Odysseus asked them for help and directions, hoping to find their way back to familiar waters, the islanders tilted their heads as if the question puzzled them. "Directions?" one of them said, his voice soft and distant, as if speaking from within a dream. "Why would you wish to leave? Here, taste this instead." They offered what was to them a sacred item, the fruit of the island's many lotus trees, holding out the strange blossoms with both hands, like priests making an offering. The lotus fruit was unlike anything the Greeks had seen before, white as ivory, with delicate petals that trembled in the breeze. 3 of Odysseus's scouts, sent ahead to investigate, took the fruit eagerly, their hunger overcoming caution. As they bit into the soft flesh, the juice ran down their chins, staining their beards purple. The effect was almost instantaneous. Their eyes grew heavy and unfocused, pupils dilating until they were black as the night. Smiles spread across their faces, the same unchanging expression worn by all the island's inhabitants. "Home," one of the scouts murmured, swaying on his feet. "What home? This is home. This has always been home." The lotus fruit, as Odysseus was soon to realize, contained a powerful drug that invaded the mind, making those who consumed it fall into a waking sleep, forgetting their past, their families, their very names, wanting nothing more than to stay on the island forever, eating lotus and dreaming empty dreams. As several more of his crew began to fall down around him, their eyes rolling back in their heads, Odysseus would realize the sinister nature of the fruit. He saw how the island's inhabitants wandered aimlessly through the groves, some sitting beneath trees for what might have been days or years, lotus juice dried on their clothes, their hair grown long and wild. "Stop!" he roared, striking the fruit from his men's hands. "Eat nothing! Touch nothing! This is a cursed place!" But for those who had already eaten, it was too late. They sat down where they were, weeping when Odysseus tried to raise them, begging to be allowed to stay and eat more lotus, to become another lost soul wandering the groves. Rescuing his sleeping companions became a battle in itself. Odysseus had to physically carry them to the ships, their bodies limp as sacks of grain, while they wept and pleaded, reaching out towards the lotus groves with trembling hands. Odysseus ordered the ships pushed off immediately, not even taking time to fill their water jars. They rowed hard, putting distance between themselves and that island of forgetfulness, with the sweet scent of lotus still clinging to their clothes. As the island disappeared into the haze behind them, the affected men finally began to wake from their stupor, remembering their names, their homes, weeping now with relief rather than loss. If you're enjoying the story so far and want access to our entire catalogue of content, then become a Deep Dive member. Here we have exclusive stories, bonus episodes, and interviews with professors and industry experts. From a 2-hour epic retelling of Jason and the Argonauts to a deep dive on Homer and the authors of Greek mythology, access it all by joining the channel membership today. Part 7. The Cyclops. Odysseus and his fleet of 12 black ships had been at sea for longer than any of them had expected. The holds that should have been filled with Trojan gold now contained only empty amphorae and the last crumbs of stale bread. The men's stomachs cramped with hunger, and their lips were cracked from rationing water under the relentless Mediterranean sun. When they finally spotted land on the horizon, the exhausted sailors pulled at their oars with renewed vigour. Stopping at the first sheltered bay they came across, they dragged their ships onto the pebbled beach and collapsed on the shore, grateful for the solid ground beneath them. As the mist cleared, Odysseus spotted smoke rising from what appeared to be a shepherd's camp in the distance, nestled between limestone cliffs. Where there were shepherds, there would be food. Selecting 12 of his most trusted warriors, Odysseus set out to investigate. Taking several cases of strong wine to trade, gifts they had been saving for their journey home, the hungry crew climbed the rocky path that wound up from the beach. The scent of sheep dung and wood smoke grew stronger as they approached. They soon discovered a massive cave, its mouth yawning wide like an entrance to the underworld itself. Inside, their eyes widened at the sight before them. Wheels of cheese, each the size of a warrior's shield, were stacked along the walls. Pails of fresh milk stood in neat rows, their surfaces still covered with thick cream. Joints of smoked meat hung from wooden beams, and pens at the back of the cave held lambs being fattened for slaughter. The warriors looked to Odysseus, practically trembling at the sight of so much food. "Quick!" one of them urged. "Let us take what we need and return to the ships before the owner returns." But Odysseus, ever curious, ever confident in his ability to talk his way through any situation, wanted to meet this wealthy shepherd. Perhaps they could establish proper trade, secure supplies for the long journey ahead. Unfortunately, it would prove to be one of the few times his cleverness would fail him. The men helped themselves to the cheese and milk, grateful to eat after days of near starvation. They were still eating when the ground around them began to shake. Heavy footsteps, each one like a boulder dropping from a cliff, approached the cave. The sheep and goats outside bleated in recognition as their master returned. Through the cave mouth came the most terrifying sight any of them had ever witnessed. Polyphemus stood 10 times the height of a normal man. His single eye bloodshot with red veins set in the centre of his broad forehead. His arms were thick as ancient oak trees, his fingers like ships' masts. He drove his flock before him into the cave, the sheep flowing around his massive legs like a white river. Once all his animals were inside, the Cyclops reached for a boulder that 20 men could not have moved. Lifting it as easily as a man might lift a sack of grain, he sealed the entrance completely, trapping the Greeks inside with only the cooking fire for light. When Polyphemus noticed the strangers huddled against the cave wall, his massive eye narrowed with rage. "Who are you?" his voice boomed, shaking dust from the ceiling. "Thieves? Pirates come to rob me?" "Neither, great shepherd," Odysseus called out. Stepping forward with the confidence that had served him well in countless negotiations during the war, "we are traders, blown off course on our journey home from Troy. We come offering wine in exchange for provisions. The laws of hospitality, protected by Zeus himself, demand—" But Polyphemus cared nothing for the laws of hospitality or the gods who protected travellers. His massive hands shot out faster than seemed possible for something so large. He grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, one in each fist. The warriors barely had time to scream before the Cyclops crushed them like ripe grapes, their bones snapping with sounds that would haunt the survivors forever. Blood ran between the giant's fingers as he brought the broken bodies to his mouth, devouring them entirely, armour and all, the bronze crunching between his teeth like nuts. The remaining Greeks stepped back, pressing themselves against the cave wall, paralysed with terror. They had faced the greatest warriors of Troy, but nothing had prepared them for this monster. Satisfied with his meal, Polyphemus lay down among his sheep and fell into a deep sleep, his snores rumbling through the cave as Odysseus and his men lay trembling in the darkness, afraid to make any move that might wake the giant. The next morning, when dawn's first light filtered through cracks around the boulder, Polyphemus rose, milked his sheep with surprising gentleness, then grabbed 2 more Greeks for his breakfast. He moved the boulder aside to let his flock out to graze, but immediately sealed it again once they had passed, trapping the survivors inside. This became the pattern of their nightmare. Each morning, 2 men for breakfast. Each evening, when the flock returned, 2 more for dinner. The cave floor became sticky with blood. Odysseus, the man whose cunning had brought down the walls of Troy, knew that pure strength alone would never defeat this monster. Even if all his remaining men attacked at once, they could never overcome the Cyclops. And even if by some miracle they killed him, they would die of starvation, trapped forever behind the immovable boulder that sealed the cave. Brute force had no place here. Only the cleverness of words and wine could save them now. On the 3rd night of their captivity, after Polyphemus had consumed 2 more companions, Odysseus approached the giant with a large ceramic jar. "Great Polyphemus," he said, his voice steady despite the gore still visible on the Cyclops' chin, "you have been feasting on my men, but you have not tasted the finest part of our cargo. This is wine from the vineyards of Ismarus, given to me by the priest of Apollo. It is strong enough that we mix 1 part wine with 20 parts water. Perhaps it would help wash down the taste of your meal." The Cyclops snatched the jar and drank deeply, the wine running down his beard as he did so. His single eye widened with pleasure. He had never tasted anything so potent, so sweet. "More!" he bellowed, and Odysseus obliged, pouring jar after jar of the unmixed wine down the giant's throat. "This is magnificent!" Polyphemus roared, already swaying slightly. "You are generous for one about to die. Tell me your name, little man, so that I might thank you properly. Perhaps I shall even give you a gift, a special honor." Odysseus bowed low, hiding his smile. "My name, generous host, is Nobody. Nobody is my name. Nobody is what my mother and father call me." "Nobody?" The Cyclops laughed, the sound booming off the cave walls. "Well then, Nobody, your gift is this. I shall eat Nobody last of all your companions first, then Nobody." He found this tremendously funny, laughing until tears ran from his great eye. The wine had done its work well. Soon the giant collapsed backwards among his sheep, unconscious, the liquid dribbling from his open mouth. Now Odysseus revealed the second part of his plan. Earlier he had found an enormous olive-wood staff in the cave, as long as a ship's mast and thicker than a man could embrace. It was the Cyclops' walking stick, left behind that morning. Working quickly but quietly, Odysseus and 4 of his strongest men sharpened one end to a vicious point, then hardened it in the coals of the fire until the tip glowed red-hot. "Remember," Odysseus whispered to his men as they lifted the massive stake, "we blind him, but do not kill him. Dead, he is a mountain of flesh blocking our escape. Alive and blind, he is our key to freedom." They positioned themselves, the stake balanced on their shoulders like a battering ram, At Odysseus's signal, they charged forward and drove the burning point deep into the Cyclops' single eye. The sound was like a blacksmith plunging hot metal into water, a horrible hissing and bubbling. The stench of burning flesh filled the cave. Polyphemus woke with a scream that seemed to split the very rocks, a sound so terrible that the Greeks nearly dropped the stake in their terror. Blood and fluid poured from the ruined eye as the giant clawed at his face, trying to pull out the weapon that had destroyed his sight. His agonized roaring was so loud that Cyclopses from all across the island came running, gathering outside the sealed cave. "Polyphemus!" they called through the boulder. "What troubles you, brother? Is someone stealing your sheep? Is someone trying to kill you?" From inside came the pain-maddened reply, "Nobody! Nobody is killing me! Nobody has blinded me!" The Cyclopses outside exchanged puzzled looks. "If nobody is hurting you," one called back, "then this must be a sickness sent by Zeus. There is nothing we can do for divine ailments. Pray to your father Poseidon for relief." And with that they wandered away, leaving Polyphemus alone in his agony. Odysseus's trick had worked perfectly. But while the giant was now blind, groping around the cave with his massive hands, trying to catch his tormentors, there was still the problem of escape. The boulder remained immovable to mortal men, and Polyphemus, despite his blindness, would have to move it in the morning to let his flock out to graze. That night, as the Cyclops moaned and cursed in the darkness, Odysseus executed the final part of his plan. Using strips torn from the clothing of their dead companions, he and his men quietly tied themselves to the undersides of the largest rams in the flock. They bound themselves tightly beneath the woolly bellies, their fingers groping deep into the fleece. When dawn came, Polyphemus, still weeping blood from his destroyed eye, felt his way to the boulder. He was no fool, even in his pain. He knew the humans would try to escape with his flock. Standing in the entrance, he carefully ran his hands over the back and sides of each sheep as it passed, checking for riders. But he never thought to feel beneath them, never imagined that men would have the strength to cling to the undersides of his rams. One by one, the sheep carried the Greeks to freedom. Odysseus went last, tied beneath the largest ram, Polyphemus's favourite. Once clear of the cave, the men cut themselves free and ran for the beach, driving a good portion of the flock before them as payment for their suffering. They loaded the sheep onto their ships and pushed off from that cursed shore as quickly as their oars could take them. They should have sailed away in silence. They should have vanished beyond the horizon without a word. But Odysseus, the hero of Troy, could not resist one final boast. As their ships pulled away from the island, he stood at the stern and shouted back at the beach, "Cyclops, you fool! Did you think the men you trapped were helpless prey? You brought this on yourself. You dared to devour guests under your own roof, and now the gods have given you what you deserve." But this was not enough for Odysseus. As Polyphemus roared in rage, the hero called out again, "If anyone asks who blinded you, who bested you with cleverness and courage, tell them it was not nobody. It was Odysseus, son of Laertes, sacker of cities, hero of Troy. It is Odysseus of Ithaca who has defeated you." From the shore came a roar of pure rage. Polyphemus, guided by the voice, hurled a massive boulder that landed just behind their ship, the splash nearly capsizing them. He threw another and another, each one falling closer as the Greeks rowed desperately for open water. But worse than the boulders was what followed. Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, faced the ocean and prayed to his father in the depths below. "Hear me, Earth-shaker, lord of the seas.
If I am truly your son, grant me this curse upon Odysseus of Ithaca. May he lose every one of his companions. May he wander the seas for years, lost and alone. And if the fates decree he must reach his homeland, let him arrive as a broken man on a foreign ship to find only sorrow in his own house."
Far beneath the waves, Poseidon heard his son's prayer. The god's anger rose like a storm tide, and from that moment Odysseus was marked. The sea itself would become his enemy. Every wave would fight against him. Every current would pull him from his course. The journey home that should have taken weeks would stretch to 10 long years. All because Odysseus, in his pride, had to reveal who had truly bested the Cyclops. Part 8. Aeolus and the Laestrygonians. Unaware of the curse that Poseidon had placed upon him, unaware that the very sea beneath his hull had become his enemy, Odysseus sailed on with his fleet. After days of rowing through calm waters that seemed almost suspiciously peaceful, they spotted something extraordinary on the horizon, an island that seemed to float above the waves. This was Aeolia, the floating kingdom of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. The king himself stood on the harbour to greet them, a figure both regal and strange, his robes constantly rippling as if touched by invisible breezes. His palace was unlike anything the Greeks had ever seen, built entirely of bronze that sang softly when the wind passed through it, creating an endless, haunting melody. For 10 days and 10 nights, Aeolus entertained his guests with magnificent feasts. The hall was filled with the king's 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters who had married one another according to their ancient customs. Each evening, Aeolus would regale them with stories of the winds themselves, how the north wind was proud and harsh, how the west wind brought rain and sorrow, how the south wind carried the heat of distant deserts. On the morning of their departure, as Odysseus's men loaded their ships with fresh supplies, King Aeolus presented his guest with an extraordinary gift. It was a leather bag made from an ox hide, bound tightly with a silver cord. "In this bag," Aeolus explained, "I have trapped every contrary wind that might blow you off course. I leave only the west wind free to carry you swiftly home to Ithaca. Guard this carefully, Odysseus. Do not open it until you stand on your own shore, or all the winds will rush out at once." Odysseus thanked the king profusely, storing the bag carefully at the stern of his ship, where he could watch it personally. Setting sail with the west wind filling their sails, the fleet made remarkable progress. For 9 days and nights, Odysseus did not sleep, his hand constantly on the steering oar, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The mysterious bag sat beside him, occasionally twitching and bulging as the imprisoned winds fought to escape. On the 10th day, exhausted but triumphant, Odysseus could see it at last. Ithaca. His homeland rose from the sea, its familiar mountains sharp against the sky. They were so close that he could hear dogs barking on the shore. Finally, overcome by exhaustion, convinced that safety was assured, Odysseus allowed his eyes to close. It was the moment his crew had been waiting for. For 10 days they had watched their captain guard that leather bag, never letting anyone near it. They had whispered among themselves during the night watches, convinced that Aeolus had filled it with gold and silver, treasures that Odysseus planned to keep for himself, while they, who had suffered equally at Troy, would receive nothing. "Look at him," muttered one sailor to another as they crept towards the stern. "He returns home with wealth, while we have only scars to show our families." "We deserve our share," agreed another, reaching for the silver cord. "Just a handful of gold each. Surely he won't miss that." The moment they loosened the cord, disaster struck. The bag erupted like a volcano, all the imprisoned winds bursting forth at once in a screaming gale that sent men tumbling across the deck. The north wind and the south wind fought each other in violent spirals. The east wind slammed into the west wind. The storm seized their ships and tossed them violently, masts snapping, sails tearing to rags. Men clung to whatever they could find as the fleet was hurled backwards across the sea, away from Ithaca, away from home, spinning helplessly in the tempest. Odysseus woke to find himself being dragged across the deck by the tempest. Through the spray and chaos, he saw Ithaca disappearing into the distance, becoming smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely. The despair that gripped him was so complete that for a moment he considered throwing himself into the churning sea. Only the thought of his men, screaming in terror as they fought to control their ships, kept him at his post. When the winds finally exhausted themselves, when the sea finally calmed, the battered fleet found itself back where they had started. The walls of Aeolia rose before them once again, but this time no welcome awaited them. When Odysseus climbed the familiar path to the palace, he found the great bronze doors barred against him. "Go away!" King Aeolus called from the walls, his face cold as the north wind. He commanded, "I know now what you are, Odysseus. No mortal could squander such a gift through mere misfortune. The gods themselves must despise you to have brought you back to my door. I will not help one whom the immortals have cursed. Leave my island immediately, or I shall unleash such winds as will tear your ships to splinters." With no choice but to obey, Odysseus returned to his men, the weight of failure heavy on his shoulders. They sailed away from Aeolia in silence, rowing when the wind failed them, each stroke of the oars feeling like a condemnation. Still unaware that it was Poseidon himself who orchestrated their misfortunes, they pressed on through waters that grew stranger with each passing day. After 6 days of hard rowing, with their water running low and the men grumbling about their captain's leadership, they spotted land once more. It was a harbour unlike any they had seen before, perfectly circular, surrounded by tall cliffs that rose like walls on every side. The entrance was so narrow that the ships had to enter in single file. Inside, the harbour was eerily calm, the water completely still. It seemed safe, protected, a perfect place to rest and resupply. 11 of the 12 ships entered the harbour, tying up alongside each other in the still water. But Odysseus, made cautious by the recent disasters, kept his own ship outside, mooring it to a rock near the harbour's mouth, where he could make a quick escape if needed. He selected 3 of his most reliable scouts, men who had served him well at Troy, and sent them inland to learn about the inhabitants and perhaps trade for supplies. The scouts climbed the cliff path eagerly, glad to stretch their legs after days at sea. At the top, they found themselves on a broad plain with a road that led towards smoke rising in the distance. The first person they encountered was a young woman, tall and strong, carrying a water jar on her shoulder. She seemed friendly enough, smiling at their greeting and pointing them toward the town when they asked, but there was something unsettling about her size. She stood a full head taller than the tallest of them, and her arms were as thick as a man's thigh. Following her directions, they entered what they thought was a town, but quickly realized was something far more terrifying. The buildings were enormous, the doorways so high that the Greeks had to crane their necks to see the tops. And then they saw the inhabitants, giants, true giants, each one larger than any being they had seen before. The scouts ran, but they had been seen. The alarm went up, a horrible bellowing that echoed across the plain. The giants, the Laestrygonians, as they were known, came pouring out of their houses, hundreds of them, men and women alike, all massive, all hungry, for these were not just giants, but cannibals, and they had not tasted human flesh in many months. The 3 scouts sprinted back toward the cliffs, but only one made it. The other 2 were caught, their screams cut short as the giants grabbed them and bit through their armour as easily as biting through bread. The surviving scout tumbled down the cliff path, screaming warnings to the fleet below. But it was too late. The Laestrygonians had reached the cliff tops. Looking down at the trapped ships in the harbour, they saw a feast laid out before them. The giants began tearing huge chunks of rock from the cliff tops, boulders the size of ox carts, and hurling them down at the Greek ships below. The harbour that had seemed like such perfect protection now sealed their fate. The ships had nowhere to manoeuvre, packed together as they were in the narrow space. The first boulder struck a ship head-on, breaking it in half, men spilling into the water. Another boulder, then another, came crashing down. The giants' aim was deadly accurate, generations of this exact hunting method having made them expert marksmen. Ships splintered and sank. Men thrashed in the water, trying to swim for safety, but the Laestrygonians had come down to the water's edge now, spearing the swimmers like fish, pulling them from the water and devouring them while they still screamed. The harbour turned red with blood, littered with broken timber and the floating bodies of those the giants were saving for later. Odysseus, watching in horror from his ship outside the harbour, knew there was nothing he could do. Those men were doomed. With tears streaming down his face, he cut his mooring rope and ordered his crew to row for their lives. Behind them, the screams of their comrades grew fainter and fainter, until there was only the sound of the giants' laughter carrying across the water. Of the 12 ships that had escaped Polyphemus's island, only one remained. Of the hundreds of men who had survived Troy, only Odysseus's own crew of 45 souls still lived. As they rode through the night, exhausted and traumatized, each man wondered the same thing. What god had they offended to deserve such relentless catastrophe? Part 9. Circe. Days passed at sea as the men mourned their losses before they finally spotted another island. Odysseus's remaining ship, battered and leaking, desperately needed repairs. The men needed food and fresh water, but more than that, they needed hope. The island was called Aea, though they did not know its name yet, nor that it was home to Circe, daughter of the sun god Helios. Circe was a sorceress whose knowledge of herbs and potions was matched only by her beauty and her hatred of outsiders. Odysseus divided his remaining men into 2 groups. Half would stay with him to guard the ship and set up camp on the beach. The other group would explore inland and search for inhabitants. The men drew lots to see who would go, many of them trembling as they reached into the helmet, praying they would be allowed to stay with the ship. The unlucky group, 22 men led by Odysseus's trusted lieutenant, Eurylochus, set off inland with heavy hearts. They followed a path that wound through the forest between ancient oaks and pines. The further they walked, the stranger things became. They began to see animals watching them from between the trees, but these were not the deer or rabbits one might expect. Lions lounged in the undergrowth, their golden eyes tracking the Greeks' movement. Wolves sat calmly beside the path, their tongues lolling out as if they were dogs waiting for their master. The men gripped their swords tighter, expecting an attack at any moment, but the beasts made no aggressive moves. If anything, they seemed almost sad, whimpering softly as the Greeks passed. One wolf even approached Eurylochus, nuzzling his hand gently before slinking back into the forest. At the heart of the island stood a beautiful house built of polished stone that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. The walls were perfectly smooth, without seam or mortar, as if the entire structure had been carved from a single enormous rock. From within came the sound of singing, a woman's voice, so lovely that the men stopped in their tracks, enchanted by the melody. The voice sang of ancient things, of the time before Zeus ruled, when the Titans still walked the earth. The doors of the house stood open, and through them wafted the most incredible smells: roasting meat, fresh bread, wine spiced with cinnamon and honey. The men's stomachs, empty for days except for ship's rations, rumbled with desire. After a brief discussion, they called out a greeting. The singing stopped, and a woman appeared in the doorway. She was beautiful beyond description, tall and graceful, with dark hair that fell to her waist. She wore robes of silk that shifted and shimmered as she moved. This was Circe, though she introduced herself simply as the Lady of the Island. "Travellers!" she exclaimed, her voice warm with welcome. "How wonderful to have guests! You look exhausted and hungry. Please come inside. I've just prepared a feast, as if the fates themselves told me to expect company." All 22 men followed her eagerly inside. Only Eurylochus held back, some instinct warning him against trusting this mysterious woman. Perhaps it was the way the lions and wolves had behaved, or perhaps it was simply that they had encountered too many disasters to trust easy hospitality. He hid himself behind a pillar where he could peer through a window and watch what transpired within. The interior of the house was even more magnificent than the exterior. Furniture of silver and gold sat between tapestries that depicted the deeds of gods and heroes. Circe seated the men on beautiful chairs and benches, clapping her hands to summon previously unseen servants who brought plate after plate of food. There was barley meal mixed with cheese and honey, and strong wine in polished cups. The men ate ravenously, laughing and joking for the first time in weeks. But Eurylochus, watching from his hiding place, saw what the others did not. He saw Circe moving behind the feasting men, pulling a small vial from her robes and letting drops of clear liquid fall into each cup of wine. He saw her lips moving in a chant, though he could not hear the words over the men's cheerful conversation. And he saw her draw a long wand of polished wood from her sleeve, holding it ready. The effect was almost immediate. The men's eyelids began to droop. One by one they slumped forward, cups falling to the floor. Within moments, all 22 were unconscious, sprawled across the beautiful furniture where they had fallen. Circe stood among them, her beautiful face now wearing a cold smile. She raised her wand and spoke words in a language older than Greek, older perhaps than human speech itself. The air shimmered with power, and the sleeping men began to change. Their faces elongated into snouts. Their hands and feet hardened into hooves. Coarse bristles sprouted from their skin. Their armor fell away from bodies that were reshaping themselves into something no longer human. Within minutes, where 22 Greek warriors had sat, there were now 22 pigs, squealing in confusion and terror. But here was the cruelest part of Circe's magic. The men retained their human minds. Inside each pig was a man fully aware of what had happened to him, screaming internally, while only pig squeals emerged from his throat. They tried to speak, to plead, but only grunts came out. They tried to stand upright, but fell onto all fours, their new bodies refusing to obey their human instincts. Circe laughed, a sound that made clear she had done this many times before. "Come, my pretty pigs," she said, using her wand to herd them outside. "The sty awaits you. Acorns and slop will be your feast now, not wine and honey cakes." Eurylochus waited until she had driven the transformed men to a pen behind the house, then ran. He ran as he had never run before, crashing through the forest, ignoring the paths, taking the straightest route back to the beach. The docile wolves and lions watched him pass, and now he understood. They too had once been men, sailors from other ships, transformed by Circe's magic into beasts. He burst onto the beach just as the sun was setting, falling to his knees before Odysseus, gasping out the terrible tale between ragged breaths. The men who had remained with the ship listened in horror, many of them weeping for their transformed comrades. Odysseus listened to every word. When Eurylochus finished, the captain stood and buckled on his sword. "Where are you going?" Eurylochus gasped. "You cannot face her alone. She is a goddess or something close to it. She will transform you as she did the others." "Then I will die trying to free them," Odysseus replied. "I have lost too many men already. I will not abandon these as well." He set off through the darkening forest, following the path Eurylochus had described, but he had not gone far when a young man stepped out from behind a tree. The stranger was beautiful beyond mortal standards, with golden hair and winged sandals, carrying a staff entwined with serpents. Odysseus recognized him immediately and fell to his knees. This was Hermes, messenger of the gods. "Rise, Odysseus," Hermes said, his voice carrying amusement. "You show more wisdom in recognizing me than in walking alone to face Circe. Still, your courage has earned you aid. The witch's magic is powerful, but not insurmountable." The god reached into his travelling pouch and withdrew a plant with a black root and white flower. "This is moly," he exclaimed, "sacred to the gods and fatal for mortals who pluck it from the earth, but I give it to you freely. Eat it now, and Circe's potions will have no power over you." Odysseus took the herb gratefully, chewing the bitter root as Hermes instructed. "When she strikes you with her wand and sees her magic fail," the god continued, "she will be afraid. Rush at her with your sword drawn as if to kill her. She will beg for mercy and invite you to her bed. Do not refuse, for she can help you free your men and aid your journey home. But first make her swear by the river Styx to do you no harm and to restore your men, or she will rob you of your strength and manhood when you are most vulnerable." With that final warning, Hermes vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, leaving Odysseus to continue on alone. When he reached Circe's glowing house, he called out as his men had done. The sorceress appeared even more beautiful in the moonlight, clearly pleased to have another visitor so soon. "Welcome, stranger," she began. "Your friends are resting comfortably. Won't you join them for dinner?" She led him inside, serving him the same meal she had given his men. Odysseus ate heartily, showing no suspicion, even drinking the wine he knew to be poisoned. Circe watched him closely, barely concealing her eagerness. When he had drained his cup, she pulled out her wand with a triumphant smile. "Now, pig, to the sty with your friends." She struck him with the wand, speaking the words of transformation. Nothing happened. Odysseus stood slowly, drawing his sword and pressing its point against Circe's pale throat. The goddess's eyes widened in genuine shock. Never before had her magic failed.
"Witch," Odysseus said, his voice hard as iron, "you will swear by the river Styx, the oath that even gods cannot break. Swear that you will restore my men to their true forms, and that you will work no more magic against me or my companions."
Circe stared at him for a long moment. Then something changed in her expression. Wonder replaced shock, and she actually smiled. "You can only be Odysseus," she said. "Hermes told me long ago that a man would come who could resist my magic, and that his name would be Odysseus of Ithaca." She moved closer, despite the sword still pointed at her throat. "Come," she said, her voice suddenly warm and inviting. "Put away your weapon and let us go to my bed. Let us learn to trust each other as only lovers can do."
"Not until you swear the oath," Odysseus replied, keeping his blade steady. "I know what you do to men when they are vulnerable."
Circe raised her hands and spoke the binding words. "I swear by the river Styx that I will work no magic against you, that I will bring you no harm in my bed or anywhere else." Thunder rumbled in the distance as the oath was sealed. "Now, son of Laertes, sheath your sword and come with me." Only then did Odysseus lower his weapon. Circe led him to her chamber, where fine tapestries hung on every wall, and the bed was spread with purple cloth. She was true to her oath, and when dawn came, she had her servants prepare a bath for him with warm water and fragrant oils. They dressed him in a fresh tunic and cloak, then led him to her hall where a feast was waiting. But Odysseus would not touch the food. He sat in silence, staring at the laden table. "What troubles you?" Circe asked. "Why do you sit like a man in mourning when I have given you everything a guest could desire?"
"How can I eat?" Odysseus replied, "when my men are still grunting in your pigsty? If you want me to feast in your hall, first restore my companions to their true forms."
Circe smiled and rose from her chair. "Your reputation for cunning is well earned." "Very well." She led him to the sty, where 22 swine crowded against the fence, squealing desperately when they saw their captain. Circe rubbed each pig with a different drug, and the magic reversed itself. Bristles fell away, hooves became hands and feet, snouts shrank back into human faces. The men stood before him, naked and confused but whole, actually looking younger and stronger than they had before their transformation. The reunion was joyful, with the men embracing each other and weeping. Circe, now bound by her oath, provided the men with clothing and food, real food this time, without any magical additions. She sent them back to the beach to fetch Odysseus's remaining crew, guaranteeing their safety. Circe was so taken with Odysseus's courage and cleverness that she invited him to stay as her guest, not as a pig in her sty, but as a man in her bed. For a full year they remained on Aea, recovering from their traumas, eating Circe's magnificent food, drinking her wine, and growing strong again. Odysseus spent his nights with the goddess, and from their union would eventually come a son, Telemachus, though Odysseus would not learn of his existence for many years. But as the year turned, the men grew restless. They had families waiting in Ithaca, wives and children who thought them dead. Finally, Odysseus too felt the pull of home and told Circe he must leave. The goddess was sad, but not surprised. "I knew this day would come," she said. "But Odysseus, Your journey home will not be easy. The gods have placed many obstacles in your path, and you sail toward dangers that would break lesser men. Before you face them, you must seek knowledge. You must sail to the very edge of the world, to the entrance of Hades itself, and speak with the ghost of the prophet Tiresias. Only he can tell you how to survive what lies ahead. She gave him detailed instructions for the terrible journey, what sacrifices to make and what words to speak. As his men prepared the ship for departure, loading it with supplies Circe had provided, she pulled Odysseus aside one final time. "Remember, hero," she said, touching his face gently, "the sea itself is your enemy, though you do not yet know why. Every wave hides a danger, every calm conceals a storm. Trust nothing, question everything, and perhaps, just perhaps, you will see Ithaca again." As their black ship sailed away from Aea, Odysseus stood at the stern, watching the island fade into the distance. But not all his men were aboard. In the rush of departure, no one had noticed that Elpino, the youngest of the crew, was missing. The night before, Elpino had drunk heavily at the farewell feast. Seeking fresh air, he had climbed a ladder to Circe's flat roof and passed out, completely deaf to the world. When the morning came and he heard his companions calling to each other, preparing the ship for departure, Elpino woke with a start. Still drunk and confused about where he was, he stood up quickly and walked straight off the edge of the roof. It was not a great height, but he fell head first, his neck snapping against the stone courtyard below. His soul fled immediately to the house of Hades, travelling swifter than any ship, so that his ghost would arrive in the underworld before his companions, waiting there to beg Odysseus for the proper burial his body had been denied. They would not discover his absence until they were far out to sea, and by then it was too late to turn back. The men wept for their lost companion, another life claimed by this cursed journey, but they could only sail forward, preparing themselves for the descent to the very edge of the world that Circe had described. Part 10. The Underworld. Following Circe's precise instructions, Odysseus and his men sailed to the very edge of the world, where the sun never shines, and the river Oceanus meets the entrance to Hades. The water here was black as tar, and a thick mist clung to everything, so dense that they could barely see the prow of their own ship. No birds flew in this cursed sky. No fish swam in these dead waters. Even the wind seemed reluctant to blow here, forcing them to row through the still waters. They beached their ship on a shore of dark sand that crunched like bones beneath their feet. Before them lay the grove of Persephone, queen of the underworld, where black poplars and willows grew, their branches drooping toward the dead earth. These trees, sacred to Persephone, mark the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Beyond the grove, exactly as Circe had described, they found the place where two rivers of the underworld converged: Pyriphlegethon, the river of fire, and Cocytus, the river of lamentation, both flowing into Acheron, the river of woe. At this meeting point of the infernal rivers, Odysseus ordered his men to dig a pit. His hands shook slightly as he performed the rituals Circe had taught him. First, he poured libations around the pit, honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, and finally clear water, sprinkling white barley over it all. Then came the blood sacrifice. 2 sheep, a black ram and a black ewe, were brought forward. Odysseus cut their throats, letting the dark blood flow into the pit, while speaking the prayers to the dead that Circe had whispered to him in the night. At once, the dead began to rise. Up from the earth, drawn by the scent of blood, came spirits who rose like smoke from cracks in the ground, translucent and grey. First came the young brides who had died before their wedding nights, then unmarried youths cut down in their prime. There were old men who had lived full lives, and young girls still mourning their lost futures. Warriors came too, their ghostly forms still bearing the wounds that had killed them, phantom spears protruding from their transparent chests. The dead pressed forward in crowds, thousands upon thousands, all desperate for a taste of the blood that would briefly restore their ability to speak and think clearly. Their moaning filled the air, a sound that chilled the living to their bones. Odysseus's crew cowered behind him, some weeping with terror, overwhelmed at the sight of so many spirits. Odysseus drew his sword, using it to keep the ghosts at bay, allowing none to drink until Tiresias appeared. But the first spirit to approach was not the prophet. It was Elpenor, his youngest crew member, whose body still lay unburied on Circe's island. Unlike the other ghosts who needed blood to speak, Elpenor could still talk clearly, for without proper burial rites his soul had not fully crossed into death. "Captain," Elpenor's ghost cried, more solid than the others because his death was so recent, "how did you reach the house of Hades as fast as I, who travelled without a ship? My lord, I beg you, when you return to the world of the living, do not leave me unburied and unmourned. Return to Aea and burn my body with my armour. Build me a mound on the shore and plant my oar upon it, the oar I pulled when I was alive among my companions." Odysseus, his heart heavy with guilt, promised to fulfill these rites. Elpenor's spirit drifted back into the shadows, satisfied that he had been heard. Next came a sight that shattered Odysseus's composure entirely. From the grey masses of the dead emerged his own mother, Anticlea. When he had left for Troy, she had been alive and well, waiting for his return. Now here she stood amongst the spirits, reaching toward him with pale arms. Odysseus wept openly, realizing she must have died during his long absence. 3 times he tried to embrace her, and 3 times his arms passed through her form as if she were made of mist. But he held her back from the blood, despite desperately wanting to speak with her. Tiresias must drink first. Finally, the ghost of the Theban prophet appeared, still carrying his golden staff, even in death. Unlike the other spirits who wandered aimlessly, Tiresias moved with purpose, his blind eyes somehow seeing more clearly than those of the living. Odysseus sheathed his sword and stepped back from the pit, allowing the prophet to drink the dark blood. As the liquid passed his lips, awareness flooded back into Tiresias's features. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong, not the whisper of the other ghosts. "Odysseus of Ithaca," the prophet began, "you seek a way home, but the god who shakes the earth has made your journey bitter. Poseidon will not forget that you blinded his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. Still, you may yet reach home if you can control yourself and your men." The prophet spoke, as if seeing terrible visions, as he continued, "You will come to the island of Thrinacia, where the sun god Helios keeps his sacred cattle. These golden beasts number 350, and they neither give birth nor die. If you harm even one of them, I foresee destruction for your ship and all your crew. You alone might survive, but you would return home on a foreign ship, broken and alone, to find trouble in your own house
arrogant men consuming your wealth and courting your wife."
Odysseus listened intently as Tiresias described the trials that lay ahead, and when the prophet finally finished speaking and withdrew, Odysseus finally allowed his mother to approach the blood. As she drank, recognition dawned in her ghostly features.
"My son," she said, tears forming in her eyes, "how are you down here in this darkness while still alive? Have you been wandering all these years since Troy? Have you not yet reached Ithaca or seen your wife or son?"
Through his own tears, Odysseus told her of his trials. In return, she gave him news of home. His wife Penelope still waited, though she wept each night. His son Telemachus, just a baby when he left, was now grown to manhood. His father, old Laertes, had withdrawn from the palace to live like a peasant on his farm, grieving for his lost son. As for herself, she had died not of illness, but of longing, her heart broken by Odysseus's absence. Odysseus tried to embrace his mother, to feel her warmth one final time, but she slipped through his arms like smoke. "We are ghosts, my son, nothing more," she explained sadly. "Return to the living, and to your wife, who waits for you." After his mother withdrew, many other spirits came forward to drink. Odysseus saw queens and princesses of old, alongside heroes from ancient times. Then came a procession that filled him with both joy and sorrow, the ghosts of his comrades from Troy. First was Agamemnon, the great king who had led the Greek forces. He wept as he told Odysseus of his murder at the hands of his own wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover, struck down on the very day he returned home from war.
"Trust no woman completely," the dead king warned bitterly, "though your Penelope was always wise and faithful." Then came Achilles, the greatest warrior who ever lived, still magnificent, even as a spirit. After drinking the blood, he recognized Odysseus immediately. "Achilles," Odysseus said warmly, "you had everything in life, fame, honor, and the respect of every Greek warrior. And look, even now you're a king amongst the spirits. Surely death is not so terrible for you." "Do not try to console me about death," Achilles replied bitterly. "I would rather be alive as the lowest slave to the poorest master than rule as king over the dead." The great warrior, who had chosen glory and death over a long but quiet life, now saw that choice had been wrong. Nothing in death was worth the simplest pleasures of being alive. As Odysseus continued speaking with his dead companions, the spirits began to grow more restless. More and more crowded forward, thousands of them, their moaning growing louder until it was like the roar of a terrible storm. They pressed closer and closer, no longer held back by his sword, their pale hands reaching, touching, grasping. "Back to the ship!" Odysseus shouted to his terrified men. They ran through the grove of Persephone, the twisted trees seeming to grasp at them with their skeletal branches. Behind them, the moaning of the dead rose to a horrible crescendo. They pushed their black ship into the water and rowed with all their strength, not daring to look back at the cursed shore. Having escaped the madness, Odysseus and his men sailed back across the ocean toward Aea, Circe's island, where they had one final task to fulfill. They found Elpenor's body exactly where it had fallen, still lying in the courtyard beneath Circe's roof, his neck bent at an unnatural angle. The men who had mocked him for his drinking now shed tears as they carried him to the shore. They built his funeral pyre high, burning his body with his armor as he had requested.
When the flames died down and they had gathered his bones, they raised a mound over them and planted his oar on top, the oar he had pulled when he lived amongst them. Circe met them at her house, accompanied by servants carrying bread, meat, and wine. She had prepared a feast, knowing they would need strength for what lay ahead. As the men ate and tried to forget the horrors of the underworld, Circe drew Odysseus aside, leading him to a quiet corner where they could speak privately. "So you have been to the house of the dead and returned," she said, studying his face. "Listen carefully, for the journey ahead holds dangers that make the underworld seem peaceful. I will tell you exactly what you must do to survive, though I warn you now, not all your men can be saved." Through the night, as his exhausted crew slept, Circe detailed every horror that awaited them. She spoke of creatures and monsters, of impossible choices, where men would die no matter what path he chose. She taught him strategies and secrets, and when the next day came, she helped them load their ship with provisions. As they prepared to depart, Circe stood on the shore, her dark hair bound up for the morning breeze. "Remember everything I have told you," she called to Odysseus. "Trust nothing in the sea ahead, for Poseidon's rage follows you still." Then she sent a favourable wind to fill their black sail, the last gift she would ever give them. Part 11. The Sirens. They had been sailing for half a day when the wind that Circe had sent suddenly died. The sail hung slack, and the sea became perfectly still, not a ripple disturbing its surface. The men looked at each other uneasily. Such sudden calms were never natural, always the work of gods or monsters. Then they heard it, carried across the water, though there was no wind to bear it, singing. It started faintly, like voices from a distant shore, but grew clearer with each stroke of their oars. The melody was unlike anything mortal musicians could create, each note so perfect it made them forget everything else. Odysseus knew immediately what they faced. "The Sirens," he said to his crew, and several men went pale. Every sailor had heard tales of these creatures, though none had ever returned to describe them. They sat on their island, surrounded by the bones of men who had steered toward their voices, forgetting home, forgetting family, forgetting everything but the need to hear their song more clearly. "Quick!" Odysseus commanded, pulling out a wheel of beeswax Circe had given him. "Soften this in your hands and plug your ears completely. Let no sound through, no matter how beautiful." The men obeyed hastily, rolling the wax between their palms until it was soft enough to shape, then pressing it deep into their ears. The world went silent for them, even the splash of the oars now soundless. But Odysseus, driven by curiosity, wanted to be the first man to hear the siren's song and live to tell of it. "Bind me to the mast," he ordered his men, who could read his lips, though they heard no sound. "Use the strongest ropes, and no matter what I say or do not release me until we are far past the Sirens' island. If I struggle, if I plead, if I command you as your captain, only tie me tighter." They wrapped the rough rope around him and the mast, binding his arms to his sides, securing his legs so he could not move. Perimedes and Eurylochus, his most trusted men, stood guard beside him with more rope ready. As they rowed closer, the singing grew louder, and Odysseus finally heard the words clearly. "Odysseus, great Odysseus, clever king of Ithaca's shore, Come and hear the truths that no man has heard before. Come closer, famed Odysseus, honoured by the gods above. We sing of war and wisdom, of glory and of love. All the secrets Troy concealed, all the mysteries of fate, rest here upon our island. Come, before it grows too late. The voices were beyond beautiful. They promised knowledge, understanding, answers to every question he had ever asked. They knew his name, his deeds, his deepest desires. Odysseus felt his mind clouding. He had to get closer, had to hear more. He struggled against the ropes, the coarse fibres cutting into his skin as he fought.
"Release me!"
he shouted at his men, but they rode on, their faces set with determination, hearing nothing. He pleaded, he commanded, he threatened them with death for disobeying their captain. Perimedes and Eurylochus simply stepped forward and added more rope, binding him so tightly he could barely breathe. The song continued, each verse more enticing than the last. The Sirens sang of his cleverness at Troy, of the wooden horse that had ended the war. They sang of his future glory, of secrets only the gods knew. Tears streamed down Odysseus's face as he struggled, his wrists bleeding where the rope cut into them, his voice growing hoarse from shouting commands no one could hear. But gradually, impossibly, the island began to fall behind them. The song grew fainter, though Odysseus strained to hear every last note. Finally, when the island had vanished completely over the horizon and the men could see their captain had stopped struggling, they removed the wax from their ears and untied him. Odysseus collapsed to the deck, shaking. His throat was raw, his wrists and arms marked with rope burns. But he had heard the siren song and survived, the first mortal ever to do so. What he did not know was that he would also be the last, for on their island the Sirens had fallen silent. An ancient prophecy had declared that if any mortal resisted their song, they must die. As his ship disappeared into the distance, the creatures threw themselves into the sea, their bodies washing up on the shore to join the bones of their countless victims. Part 12. Scylla and Charybdis. The relief of surviving the Sirens lasted only until the next morning, when Odysseus saw what lay ahead. The sea narrowed into a strait between two cliffs, with him realizing instantly that they had reached a passage Circe had warned him about. The cliff on the left was shrouded in a deep mist, and even from a distance they could hear the roar of Charybdis. 3 times a day, this monstrous whirlpool sucked down the waters, exposing the sandy seafloor littered with shipwrecks, then vomited it back up in a towering spout that reached to the clouds. Any ship caught in her pull would be dragged down to destruction, every soul aboard lost. Meanwhile, the right cliff rose sharply from the water, its face dotted with dark caves. Halfway up, in the largest cave, lived Scylla. Circe had described her in horrible detail, 6 heads on 6 long necks, each mouth filled with triple rows of teeth. Below them, 12 feet scratched at the rock, though her body remained hidden deep within the cave, never fully seen by anyone who lived to tell of it. She would snatch sailors from passing ships, 1 for each head, and devour them alive, as their shipmates watched in horror. Odysseus faced an impossible choice, exactly as Circe had warned. There was no path between the monsters, the strait was too narrow. He would have to choose which one to face. Charybdis would destroy them all, but Scylla would take 6 men, no more, no less. 6 men whose deaths would buy passage for the rest. He made his decision without telling the crew. Better they did not know until it was too late to be afraid. "Row toward the right cliff," he commanded, his voice steady though his heart was breaking. "Stay as far from the whirlpool as possible, but keep rowing no matter what happens." As they entered the strait, Charybdis began to suck down the sea. The men gasped in horror as they saw the whirlpool's throat, a spinning funnel that seemed to reach down to the foundation of the world. The current pulled at their ship, trying to drag them in, and they rowed desperately to keep clear. Every man watched the whirlpool, transfixed by the terrible sight. Which was why they did not see Scylla until it was too late. 6 heads shot down from the cave above, moving so fast they seemed to blur. Each grabbed a man from his rowing bench, lifting him high into the air. The victims had time for just one scream, calling out to Odysseus, their arms reaching toward him even as their heads retracted back towards the cave. The sound that followed was worse than their screams. The cracking of bones, the tearing of flesh as Scylla devoured them. Their companions could only row harder, tears streaming down their faces as the monster ate their friends above their heads. Blood dripped down onto the deck, yet still they rowed, because to stop was to mean instant death. When they finally cleared the strait, emerging into open water, the men collapsed over their oars, sobbing. 6 more companions gone, their deaths necessary for the survival of the rest. Odysseus stood at the helm. He had made the choice, Circe advised, the only choice that left any of them alive. But the faces of the 6 men Scylla had taken would haunt him forever. Storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon, black and ominous. The men had no time to mourn properly. They had to find shelter, and soon enough they spotted an island ahead. Thrinacia, the land of the sun. Part 13. The Cattle of the Sun. Odysseus knew this island the moment he saw it. The prophecy of Tiresias rang in his ears, the ghost's warning clear as day, "Touch not the cattle of Helios, or all your men will perish." He wanted to sail past, to avoid the danger entirely, but his crew was exhausted, traumatized, pushed beyond endurance. "Please, Captain," Eurylochus spoke for all of them, "we need rest. We need to mourn our dead. Just one night on shore, and we'll sail at dawn." Against his better judgment, Odysseus agreed, but he made them all swear a solemn oath. This island belongs to Helios, the sun god who sees all. His sacred cattle graze here, immortal beasts that must not be touched. Swear by the river Styx that you will only eat the provisions Circe gave us. Not one animal on this island must be harmed." They all swore, too tired to imagine they could break such an oath. They beached the ship in a sheltered cove and made camp, planning to leave with the morning light. But that night, Zeus sent a storm. It was no ordinary tempest. The south wind howled, driving waves the height of mountains against the shore. Lightning split the sky continuously, and rain fell in sheets so thick they could not see 10 feet ahead. The storm raged for a day, then a week, then 2 weeks. Their black ship would have been shattered to splinters if they had tried to launch it. At first, the men lived on the provisions from Circe, grain and wine and preserved meat. But as the storm stretched into its 3rd week, then its 4th, the supplies dwindled. They tried fishing, but the storm had driven all fish to deeper waters. They hunted birds, but found only a few scrawny seagulls. They gathered shellfish from the rocks, but it was never enough. Meanwhile, the cattle of Helios wandered the island in great herds, golden-horned and beautiful, their hides glowing with the light of the sun. 350 of them, each one perfect, neither aging nor breeding, as eternal as their master. They would walk past the camp, close enough to touch, their meat enough to feed the crew for weeks on end. By the end of the month, the men were skeletal, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunk deep in their skulls. They chewed leather, they boiled grass. Some tried eating dirt to fill their empty stomachs, and still the storm raged on. Odysseus went alone to the interior of the island to pray to any god who might listen. Exhausted and weak from hunger, he found a cave sheltered from the wind and knelt to make his prayers. But the gods sent him sleep instead of answers, and he collapsed into unconsciousness. It was Eurylochus who spoke first amongst the men. "Brothers," he said, "all deaths are terrible, but starving is the worst. Better to die quickly at the hands of the gods than waste away to nothing. We'll kill the finest cattle and sacrifice them properly to the immortals. If Helios is angry, if he destroys us at sea, at least we'll die with full stomachs, like men instead of beggars." The starving crew needed no more encouragement. They chose the best cattle from the herd, beautiful beasts with golden horns and pure white hides. They performed all the proper rituals, making prayers and promises to build temples if they survived. Then they slaughtered the animals, butchered them expertly, and set the meat to roast over fires. The smell of cooking beef drifted across the island and reached Odysseus in his cave, waking him instantly. He ran back toward the beach, but even before he crested the hill, he knew what had happened. He could hear the sizzle of fat in the fires, could see the smoke rising into the dark sky. When he saw the spitted carcasses, the men gorging themselves on the sacred meat, he fell to his knees and wept. "You fools!" he cried. "You've killed us all! Those cattle belonged to the god who drives the sun across the sky, who sees everything that happens on earth. We are all dead men." But the crew was beyond caring. They had been starving for a month, and the meat was sweet beyond description. They feasted for 6 days, until, suddenly, on the 7th, the storm stopped. The wind died, the clouds parted, and the sea became calm once more. Even as they loaded their ship, strange omens appeared. The cattle hides crawled along the ground, as if alive. The meat on the spits began to bellow like living beasts, but the men were desperate to leave, to escape before even worse happened. They had barely cleared the island when Helios made his complaint to Zeus.
"Father of the gods," the sun god raged, "the mortals have slaughtered my sacred cattle, the beasts I look down upon with joy each day as I drive my chariot across the sky. If they are not punished, I will drive my chariot down to Hades and shine among the dead instead of the living."
Zeus could not allow the sun to abandon the sky. He sent a black cloud that rushed across the water faster than any natural storm. The men barely had time to lower the sail before the tempest struck. Lightning split the mast in half, sending it crashing down to crush the helmsman's skull. The thunderbolt that followed split the ship from stem to stern, opening it like a seed pod. The men were flung into the raging sea. They bobbed like seabirds for a moment, calling to each other, trying to grab floating pieces of the wreck. Then the waves took them one by one, pulling them under. These men who had survived Troy, the Cyclops, the Laestrygonians, Circe, the journey to the Underworld, Scylla, all of them drowned in minutes, their bodies never to be found or given proper burial. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to the broken mast that he had tied to a beam from the wreck. For 9 days and nights he drifted, without food or water, burned by the sun and frozen by the night, delirious and close to death. On the 10th day, the currents carried him to an island forgotten by gods and men, where the beautiful nymph Calypso found him unconscious on her shore, more dead than alive. The prophecy had come to pass exactly as Tiresias had foretold. Every single one of his men was gone, and Odysseus was alone, cast up on a foreign shore with no ship, no crew, and no way home. Poseidon's curse had claimed them all, except the one man the god wanted to suffer most. Part 14. The Journey Home. "And so," Odysseus said, his voice hoarse from his long story, "Calypso found me on her shore. For 7 years she kept me on her island, offering immortality if I would stay as her husband. But I thought only of my home, of Penelope and Telemachus, the son I had never seen grow to manhood. Finally the gods commanded her to release me. She helped me build a raft, and I sailed for 7 days before Poseidon saw me and shattered my vessel with another storm. That was when your princess, Nausicaa, found me, naked and exposed on your beach, and brought me to this hall." The great hall of the Phaeacians had fallen completely silent. King Alcinous and Queen Arete sat transfixed, along with all their nobles. They had asked for his story, and Odysseus had given it to them in its entirety, from Troy to their very doorstep, every monster, every loss, every impossible choice. The torches had burned low during the telling, with the first rays of sunlight showing through the windows. "Never," said King Alcinous at last, "have we heard such a tale of suffering and endurance. You have convinced us utterly that you are indeed Odysseus, and we will keep our promise. Today you shall go home." The king was true to his word. The Phaeacians were master sailors, descended from Poseidon himself. They loaded a black ship with gifts, bronze tripods, golden bowls, and fine cloth, more wealth than Odysseus had lost from Troy. As the sun set, Odysseus boarded the ship. The Phaeacian crew made a bed for him on the deck, spreading out soft rugs and linen sheets. Exhausted from telling his story, and overcome by the knowledge that he was finally going home, Odysseus fell into the deepest sleep he had known in 20 years. The ship flew across the water under the guidance of its expert crew. All through the night it sailed, carrying the long-suffering man towards his homeland. Arriving at the shores of Ithaca, they ran the ship onto the sandy beach so gently that Odysseus never woke. Still deep in sleep, they lifted him from the deck and laid him on the sand, placing all the Phaeacian gifts beside him. Then, their task complete, they sailed for home. But Poseidon's rage was not finished. As the Phaeacian ship came within sight of their own island, the earth-shaker struck. He turned the ship and all its crew to stone just as it reached the harbour, fixing it forever as a rock in the shallow water, a warning to all who would help his enemies. Around their city he raised a ring of mountains, cutting them off from the sea they had mastered, ending their days as a nation of sailors. King Alcinous, watching from the shore, understood immediately what had happened. The prophecy his father had spoken years ago had come to pass, that one day Poseidon would punish them for ferrying strangers safely across the seas. The king ordered great sacrifices to the Earth-shaker, 12 perfect bulls slaughtered on the beach, their blood soaking into the sand. The entire city gathered in prayer, begging Poseidon to show mercy. But the damage was done. The ship remained stone, and the mountains stood firm around their city, forever ending their days of free passage across the waves. Odysseus woke on the beach of Ithaca, but he did not know it. Athena, always watching over her favourite mortal, had spread a thick mist over everything. The harbour, the olive trees, even the very shape of the hills, all were hidden from him. After so many deceptions, so many false hopes, she wanted to prepare him properly for what lay ahead. He sat up on the sand, looking around at the unfamiliar landscape, his heart sinking with despair. The Phaeacians had tricked him. They had promised to take him home, but had abandoned him on some unknown shore. He checked the gifts. At least they were all there, the gold and bronze and fine cloth. But what good was treasure if he was lost yet again? "Another strange land," he said aloud, his voice bitter. "Are the people here savage or civilized? Do they respect strangers, or will I have to fight them? O Zeus, why have the Phaeacians betrayed me?" As he spoke, a young shepherd appeared through the mist, handsome and well-dressed, carrying a bronze spear. Odysseus approached carefully, ready for anything. "Young man," he called, "you are the first person I've met on this shore. Please tell me truthfully, what land is this? What people live here?" The shepherd smiled. "You must come from very far away, stranger, not to know this island. This is Ithaca, famous for its goats, visible even from the mainland." Odysseus's heart leapt. But 20 years of suffering had taught him caution. He would not reveal himself to the first person he met. Instead, he spun a careful lie about being a refugee from Crete, a man who had killed someone important and fled with his treasure. The shepherd listened to the entire false tale, then laughed, not a shepherd's laugh, but the bright, delighted laughter of an immortal. The figure shimmered and changed, growing taller, more graceful. The shepherd's clothes became a shining robe, the boyish face transformed into the beautiful, grey-eyed features of Athena herself. "O Odysseus," the goddess said, still smiling, "even now, standing on your own shore, you cannot stop yourself from lying and scheming. We're alike, you and I. You the cleverest of mortals, I the wisest of immortals. Did you not know I have been watching over you all this time? I could not openly oppose Poseidon, my father's brother, but I have helped where I could." She waved her hand, and the mist dissolved. Suddenly Odysseus could see everything clearly. The olive trees he had climbed as a boy, the mountain paths where he had hunted deer with his father, the very beach where he had said goodbye to Penelope 20 years ago. This was truly Ithaca. He was home. Overcome with emotion, Odysseus fell to his knees and kissed the ground of his homeland. Then, remembering himself, he turned back to Athena. "Goddess," he said, "if this is truly Ithaca, tell me, what has become of my house? Does Penelope still wait? What of my son Telemachus?" Athena's expression grew serious. "Your house is full of enemies. Over 100 suitors from Ithaca and the nearby islands have invaded your halls, eating your cattle, drinking your wine, pressing Penelope to choose one of them as her new husband. They believe you are dead. Your wife has held them off with clever delays, but her tricks are running out. Your son Telemachus has just returned from searching for news of you. He is brave but young, and the suitors plot to kill him." She paused, studying his face as it hardened with anger. "But you are not the man to rush in swinging a sword. You are Odysseus, the man whose cunning surpasses all others. Here, listen to my plan." The goddess explained her strategy. She would disguise him as an old beggar, so that he could enter his house unrecognized, observe his enemies, and determine who among his servants remained loyal. Telemachus would be brought into the plot, but no one else, not even Penelope, could know the truth until the right moment. She touched him with her golden wand, and Odysseus felt his body changing. His skin withered and aged, becoming that of a man in his 70s. His dark hair fell out, leaving only a few grey wisps. His strong shoulders bent, while his clear eyes dimmed. She dressed him in filthy rags, torn and stained, and gave him a beggar's staff and a worn leather pouch. "Go first to the swineherd Eumaeus," Athena instructed. "He remains loyal to you and still grieves for his lost master. Stay with him while I fetch Telemachus, who needs to know his father has returned. Trust no one else, not yet. The suitors have grown bold in your absence. They would kill you without hesitation if they knew who you were." She helped him hide the Phaeacian treasure in a nearby cave, rolling a great stone across the entrance that no mortal could move. Then she vanished in a cloud of smoke, disappearing before his eyes. Odysseus stood alone on the beach of Ithaca, a beggar in appearance, but a king at heart. His 20 years of wandering finally ended. But the hardest battle still lay ahead. Taking up his beggar's staff, he turned inland towards the hut of Eumaeus to begin his final journey. Part 15. Father and Son. The path to Eumaeus's hut led upward through rocky terrain, away from the cultivated fields and into the rougher land where the pigs were kept. 4 dogs rushed at Odysseus as he approached, fierce animals trained to protect the herd. He sat down quickly and dropped his staff, a trick he had learned long ago, for attacking dogs rarely bite a seated man. Even so, they might have torn him apart if Eumaeus had not run from his hut, shouting at them to back away. "Old man," the swineherd said, helping Odysseus to his feet, "you could have been torn apart, as if I don't have enough to worry about. Here I am, fattening pigs for men who don't deserve them, while my true master is lost somewhere far from home, if he's even still alive." He led Odysseus into his hut, a simple but clean dwelling with a warm fire burning inside. Eumaeus brought him bread, roasted pork, and wine, then gathered goatskins into a makeshift bed by the fire. As Odysseus ate, he watched his old servant moving about the hut. 20 years was a long time. The man's hair had gone completely grey, his face worn down by all those years of waiting for a master who never came home. But he still fussed over his guest with the same quiet care Odysseus remembered. "Tell me about this master you mourn," Odysseus said, maintaining his disguise. "Perhaps I have encountered him in my travels." Eumaeus shook his head sadly. "Many wanderers have come to Ithaca claiming to have news of Odysseus, hoping for rewards from his poor wife. She welcomes them all,
weeps at their lies and gives them gifts. But I know the truth. My master is dead. 20 years is too long. The sea has swallowed him, or wild animals killed him in some distant land."
He continued to speak through the night about the old days, about Odysseus's kindness, his justice, how he had treated his servants like family. He told of Penelope's suffering, how the suitors consumed the wealth of the household, and how they plotted to kill Telemachus and divide the kingdom amongst themselves.
"The young master tries to stand against them," Eumaeus said, "but he is one and they are many. He has his father's courage, but not yet his cunning. I fear for him every day."
Odysseus slept that night on the goatskins, his fists clenched in anger at what he had heard, but he managed to keep his disguise. They spent 3 days together. Odysseus told false tales of his supposed life, carefully testing Eumaeus's loyalty with criticism of the absent king, with suggestions that Odysseus might never return. But he remained faithful, defending his master's memory, maintaining hope against all reason. On the 4th day, as morning came, the dogs outside began barking, not with aggression, but with joy, whining and wagging their tails. Footsteps approached, and Odysseus looked up from the fire to see a young man in the doorway, tall and well-built, carrying a bronze spear. His heart stopped. This was Telemachus, his son. The infant he had left behind was now a man. Odysseus had to grip the edge of his seat to keep from standing, from calling out. 20 years of imagining this moment had not prepared him for the reality.
"My dear child," Eumaeus cried, jumping to his feet. "Telemachus, I fear the suitors had killed you on your journey. Come in, let me look at you, safe and sound."
Odysseus watched his son embrace the swineherd with genuine warmth. When Telemachus asked about his mother, the concern in his voice made Odysseus's chest tighten. "Tell me, does my mother still resist the suitors? Has she chosen one to marry?"
"She holds firm," Eumaeus assured him. "She weeps each night, but makes no choice. But tell me of your journey. Did you find news of your father?"
"I learned he still lives," Telemachus said carefully. "Menelaus told me that Odysseus is held captive on a nymph's island, unable to sail home no matter how he might wish to. But whether that has changed, I cannot say." At that moment, Telemachus became aware of the stranger sitting by the fire. As his son's eyes landed on him, Odysseus had to force himself to remain hunched, to keep his head bowed and his manner humble. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal himself, but he mumbled a greeting befitting an old beggar.
"I must go and tell your mother you have returned safely," Eumaeus said. "She has been sick with worry."
"Go carefully," Telemachus warned. "Tell only her, not the suitors." After the swineherd left, closing the door behind him, Odysseus felt Athena's power wash over him. His disguise melted away, his back straightened and his withered skin grew smooth once more. His bald head sprouted thick hair, dark with threads of grey. The rags transformed into a clean tunic, and he stood before his son as himself for the first time in 20 years.
"You are a god,"
Telemachus gasped upon seeing the transformation.
"Please, whoever you are, have mercy on me."
The spear in Telemachus's hand, raised in fear, nearly broke Odysseus's heart.
"I am no god,"
Odysseus responded, his voice almost cracking.
"I am your father, come home at last." "No,"
Telemachus shook his head, still gripping his spear.
"My father is dead, or lost forever. You are some spirit trying to trick me, to give me hope only to crush it.
No mortal can change his appearance like that." Odysseus understood. How many times had the boy dreamed of this moment? How many false hopes had he endured?
"Athena changed me,"
Odysseus explained.
"The goddess can make me young or old, strong or weak, as she wishes. But I am truly Odysseus. I am your father, for whom you have grieved. I have come back after 20 years of suffering."
He reached out, unable to wait any longer. When Telemachus finally saw something in his face, some feature Penelope must have described 1,000 times, and threw himself into his arms, Odysseus felt complete for the first time since leaving Ithaca. He held his son, this stranger who was his blood, this man who should have grown up at his side. The years he had lost could never be recovered, but this moment, this embrace, was worth all the suffering that had brought him here. They wept together, father and son, 20 years of separation pouring out in their tears. When they could finally speak again, they sat close together, Telemachus unable to stop staring at his father, as if he might vanish again if he looked away. "How?" Telemachus asked. "How did you come here? Where have you been? Mother said you were clever, that you would find a way home, but 20 years." Odysseus told him everything, quickly but thoroughly. The war, the Cyclops, the curse of Poseidon, the years of wandering. He told him of Calypso's island, of the Phaeacians who brought him home, of Athena's plan.
"Now," Odysseus said, his voice hardening, "tell me of these suitors. How many? Who leads them? What weapons do they have?"
They spent hours planning. Telemachus described each suitor, their strengths and weaknesses. Antinous, the cruelest and strongest. Eurymachus, the smoothest talker, who acted polite while planning to kill them. The others who followed these two leaders like sheep. "Tomorrow," Odysseus instructed, "you return to the palace as if nothing has happened. I will follow later as a beggar. No matter what you see, if they strike me, if they humiliate me, you must not react. Show no sign that you know me." "Father, I cannot watch them abuse you." "You must. Our advantage is surprise. They believe I am dead. Let them continue believing until the moment we strike. When I give the signal, you must remove all weapons from the hall where they feast. Tell them you are storing them away from the smoke of the fire. Leave only enough for us. 2 swords, 2 spears, and 2 shields." Odysseus gripped his son's shoulders. "Listen closely, my boy. The only loyal servants are Eumaeus and the cowherd, Phaeacians, but even they cannot know yet. Not even Penelope can know I have returned. A secret shared is a secret lost, and if the suitors learn I live, they will kill us both before we can act." "What of Mother?" Telemachus asked. "She has waited so long, suffered so much. How can I look her in the eye and not tell her?" "Because you love her," Odysseus said firmly. "Her genuine grief, her true ignorance, these protect us all. When this is over, when the suitors lie dead, then she will know, but not before." As the sun began to set, they heard footsteps approaching, quickly. Athena's power washed over Odysseus. By the time Eumaeus entered, he was once again a pitiful beggar. He brought news from the palace. Penelope rejoiced at Telemachus's return, but the suitors were furious that their planned ambush of him had failed. They were debating whether to try another assassination or to force Penelope to choose immediately. "Then we have little time," Telemachus said. "Tomorrow I return to face them." "Be careful, young master," Eumaeus warned. "They grow desperate, and desperate men are dangerous." That night, as they shared a simple meal, Odysseus watched his son by the firelight. Despite everything, he smiled. His son had become a man he could be proud of.
"Sleep well,"
Odysseus told him as they prepared for bed.
"Tomorrow, we begin to take back what is ours."
Part 16. Return to the Palace. Odysseus stood at the gates of his own palace, transformed once again into the old beggar by Athena's power. Telemachus had gone ahead as planned, and now Eumaeus led him toward the great hall, warning him to expect cruelty from the men inside. The swineherd had no idea he was escorting the king himself to reclaim his throne. As they approached the courtyard, Odysseus stopped. There, abandoned on a heap of mule dung that servants would later spread on the fields, was a dog. Ancient and skeletal, covered in flies and sores, the creature could barely lift its head. But Odysseus knew him instantly. This was Argus, the hunting dog he had raised from a pup, the one who used to sleep at his feet, who he had trained with his own hands before sailing to Troy. The dog's clouded eyes turned toward the approaching footsteps. Then something miraculous happened. Despite the disguise, despite 20 years of absence, Argus recognized his master. With tremendous effort, the dying dog tried to drag himself forward, but his legs would not obey. All he could manage was the faintest movement of his tail, trying so hard to wag, and a soft whimper that said everything. "You came back. I waited. You came back." Odysseus felt his throat close with grief. Tears burned behind his eyes as he watched his faithful friend struggle even to lift his head. He wanted to run to Argus, to hold him, to tell him what a good dog he had been, to thank him for waiting. But he could not. One word, one gesture, and his disguise would shatter.
"Whose dog is that?"
he managed to ask, his voice barely steady.
"He must have been magnificent once."
"That's Argus," Eumaeus said quietly.
"He belonged to our lost king Odysseus, once the fastest, finest hunting dog in all of Ithaca. He could track a wounded deer for miles, catch any hare. But when his master never returned from Troy, everyone forgot about him. He should have died years ago, but somehow he's held on all this time, still waiting for Odysseus to come home."
Odysseus forced himself to walk past, each step agony. He could not look back, he could not say goodbye. Behind him, Argus watched his master disappear into the palace. Then, after 20 years of waiting, 20 years of refusing to die, the old dog finally closed his eyes and let go. His wait was over. His master had come home. In all his years of war and wandering, nothing had broken Odysseus's heart quite like this moment, walking past his loyal companion, who died the moment his vigil was complete. Inside the great hall, Odysseus saw what his home had become. Over 100 young men lounged on benches and chairs that had once seated honest guests. They shouted and laughed, throwing bones at each other, wine staining the floors where his father had once walked. Servants scurried between them, heads down, trying to avoid notice.
"Look!"
one of the suitors called out, spotting the beggar.
"Eumaeus has brought us entertainment. Tell us, old man, have you come to compete for scraps with the dogs?"
Laughter rippled through the hall. Odysseus kept his eyes down, playing his part, and began to move amongst them with his beggar's pouch, asking for charity as any wanderer might. Some gave him crusts of bread, amused by his presence. Others ignored him, but Antinous, the cruelest of them all, sneered when Odysseus approached.
"Get away from me, you diseased old fool," Antinous said. "We have enough parasites in this hall without adding another."
"Young lord," Odysseus replied mildly, "surely from such abundance you can spare a crust? You feast like kings in this house."
"I'll give you something,"
Antinous snarled. He picked up a footstool and hurled it at Odysseus, striking him hard in the back. The blow would have knocked down an ordinary old man. Odysseus barely moved, solid as a rock, but quickly made himself stagger to keep up his disguise. The hall fell silent for a moment. Even amongst the suitors there were some who felt this went too far. Striking a beggar, a suppliant who had asked for bread, violated the basic laws of hospitality that Zeus himself protected.
"That was poorly done, Antinous," one of the other suitors muttered. "What if he's a god in disguise? The immortals often test us this way."
But Antinous just laughed, and soon the others joined in. Odysseus retreated to a corner, his back genuinely aching from the blow, memorizing Antinous's face for what was to come. As he sat in the corner, another figure entered the hall, another beggar, but this one well known to the suitors. Iris was his name, a large man who made himself useful to the young lords by running errands and fighting for their amusement. He saw Odysseus and immediately recognized a threat to his position.
"Get out,"
Iris said, standing over Odysseus.
"This is my territory. These nobles are my patrons. Find another hall to beg in, or I'll drag you out by your ankles."
The suitors perked up, sensing entertainment.
"A fight!" Antinous called out with delight. "Let these beggars provide us with sport. The victor shall feast upon the roasted goat's stomach, while the defeated shall be cast into the street."
They formed a circle, pushing Odysseus and Iris into the centre. Odysseus rose slowly from the ground, as if his aged bones protested every movement, but as he stood his cloak fell open, revealing his arms and legs beneath. Gasps ran through the crowd. Beneath the weathered skin lay thick muscle, scarred from battles, still carrying terrible strength. The colour drained from Iris's face as he understood his mistake.
"I am but an old man,"
Odysseus announced to the crowd.
"I seek no quarrel with anyone, but if I must fight for my bread, then I shall fight."
When Iris swung wildly at him, Odysseus held back. One real blow would shatter the man's skull and expose his disguise. He caught Iris with a controlled strike to the jaw, hard enough to convince the watching crowd, but gentle enough to leave the man alive. Instantly, Iris crumpled to the floor, blood streaming from his mouth. The suitors erupted with laughter and cheers. Suddenly warming to this formidable old wanderer, they pressed the promised food into his hands and filled his cup with wine, treating him like a victor in the games. Odysseus bowed and thanked them for their generosity, all the while studying each face and learning each name for what was to come. They laughed and drank around him, these dead men, who did not yet know they had already been condemned. As evening fell, word reached Penelope that a new beggar had arrived, one who claimed to have news of Odysseus. She sent word that she would see him, and Odysseus found himself climbing the stairs to the upper chambers where his wife waited. She sat by the fire, and even in the flickering light, even with 20 years of sorrow etched on her face, she was beautiful. Odysseus had to clench his fists to keep from going to her, from revealing himself immediately, but there were servants present, and any one of them might be loyal to the suitors. "Stranger, they say you have wandered far across the earth," Penelope said, measuring each word. "Tell me truly, have you heard anything of my husband? Does Odysseus still live?" Odysseus spun her a careful tale, mixing truth with fiction. He claimed to have met Odysseus years ago in Crete, describing him perfectly: the brooch he wore, the purple cloak she had woven for him, details only someone who had truly seen him would know. Penelope wept at these descriptions. Odysseus sat rigid on his stool, fighting every instinct to go to her. Here was his beloved wife, suffering before his eyes, and he could end it with a word. But still, he held to his disguise. "I have heard," he continued, choosing his words with care, "that Odysseus lives and is making his way home. His ships are lost, his men drowned, but the man himself survived. You will see him soon, my lady. Before this month ends, I believe." She looked at him sharply, hope and skepticism warring in her eyes. "Many have told me such stories. All have proven false. This one is true," Odysseus said firmly. "Your husband will return and deal with these men who plague your house." Penelope studied him for a long moment, and something flickered in her expression, not quite recognition, but something. Then she called for the old nurse, Euryclea. "This stranger has brought me kind words," she said. "Wash his feet and prepare a proper bed for him. Treat him with the honour we once showed all guests, before this house forgot what hospitality meant." Euryclea brought a bronze basin filled with warm water. Time had aged her, but Odysseus knew those hands, the same ones that had held him as an infant, that had nursed his fevers and bandaged his wounds. This woman had raised him more truly than his own mother. As she knelt to wash his feet, Odysseus tensed. His thigh bore an old scar from a boar's tusk, a mark from his youth that Euryclea knew as well as her own palm. If she saw it, everything would unravel. He tried to turn away from the firelight, to keep his leg in shadow, but the old woman's hands were steady despite her age. As she washed his leg, her fingers found the scar and traced its familiar length. She knew it instantly. The bronze basin crashed to the floor, water spreading across the stones. Euryclea looked up at him, tears already forming, her mouth opening to cry out his name. Odysseus reached out quickly, his hand covering her mouth before she could speak. "Not a word," he whispered urgently. "Not a sound, dear nurse, or you'll destroy everything. Yes, I am Odysseus, but if the suitors learn this, they'll kill me and Telemachus and everyone loyal to this house." The old woman nodded, her hands trembling as she touched his face, assuring herself he was real. "My boy," she whispered. "My dear boy, home at last." "Tell no one," Odysseus repeated, "not even Penelope. Soon, very soon, this will end, but not yet." Euryclea composed herself with effort, cleared away the spilled water, and returned with a fresh basin. This time, as she washed his feet, every touch was a prayer of gratitude. Her lost king had come home. She left in silence when she finished, but Odysseus saw how her whole body shook with the effort of containing her joy. Penelope, who had been strangely distracted during all of this, looking into the fire as if lost in thought, turned back towards him. "Tomorrow," she said suddenly, "I will announce a contest. My husband's great bow hangs in the storeroom, the one only he could string. I will challenge the suitors to string it and shoot an arrow through 12 axe handles, as Odysseus used to do for sport. Whoever succeeds will become my husband. I cannot wait any longer." Odysseus's heart raced. Whether by divine inspiration or her own cleverness, Penelope had just given him the perfect opportunity. "That seems wise, my lady," he said carefully. "I believe Odysseus would approve. In fact, I'm certain he will be here before any suitor can string that bow." She looked at him again with that strange expression, as if seeing through his disguise, but choosing not to acknowledge it. "We shall see," she said softly, her eyes drifting to the window. Outside, the full moon cast silver light across the harbour, illuminating the very beach where a king once sailed to war. "We shall see." As Odysseus left her chamber and was guided to the room Euryclea had prepared for him, his mind was already working through the next day's plan. The bow contest would gather all the suitors in one place, focused on the competition. They would be unarmed except for their swords, with Telemachus having taken their spears as instructed. Tomorrow, the slaughter would begin. Tomorrow he would reclaim what was his. But tonight, he lay on a bed in his own house, listening to the drunken snoring of men who would soon be dead. Part 17. The Archery Contest. The next morning, the great hall filled with anticipation. Penelope descended the stairs, carrying Odysseus's bow, a massive weapon of polished horn that caught the morning light. Behind her, servants carried 12 axes and set them in a straight line, their handles planted firmly in the earthen floor, the rings at the top of each handle aligned perfectly. "Lords of Ithaca and the islands," Penelope announced, her voice reaching every corner, "I have delayed long enough. Today I will choose a husband. Here is the great bow of Odysseus. Whoever can string it and shoot an arrow through all 12 axe rings, as my husband used to do, that man I will marry." The suitors erupted in excited conversation. This was it, the prize they had waited years to claim. They cast lots to determine the order, yet it was Telemachus who stepped forward first. "I should try before any of you," he said. "If I can string my father's bow and make the shot, then my mother stays in this house as my guest, not as another man's wife." 3 times Telemachus tried to string the bow. On the 3rd attempt he nearly succeeded. The bow began to bend, the string approached the notch, but he caught Odysseus's watching gaze, saw the subtle shake of his father's head from the corner where he sat, and let the bow spring back. "I lack the strength," Telemachus said, though everyone had seen how close he had come. "Perhaps one of you older, stronger men will succeed." One by one, the suitors tried. First Leodes, the priest amongst them, whose soft hands were torn bloody by the bowstring before he gave up. Then others, each in turn, their faces growing red with effort, veins bulging in their necks as they fought to bend the ancient weapon. They ordered a fire built closer to warm the bow, thinking the horn might be stiff from disuse. They rubbed it with fat to make it supple. Nothing helped. The bow remained unbent, unconquered, as if it were waiting for its true master. While the strongest suitors prepared for their attempts, Odysseus slipped out to the courtyard, where Eumaeus stood with Phaeacians, a loyal cowherd who had served the house since before he had left for Troy. "Tell me honestly," he said to them quietly, "if Odysseus suddenly returned, would you fight for him or for the suitors?" Both men swore they would die for their true king, and Odysseus revealed himself, showing them the scar as proof. They were overjoyed and tried to embrace him, but he stopped them quickly. "There's no time," he said. "Here's what you must do. Eumaeus, bring the bow to me when the suitors have all failed. Ignore their protests. Phaeacians, bar the doors to the hall once I have the bow. Let no one in or out. Now go, and show no emotion when you return." Back inside, Eurymachus was straining with the bow, his handsome face twisted with effort. "This bow will be the death of us," he gasped as he gave up. "Not because we lose Penelope, but because we'll be shamed forever. Too weak to string the bow that Odysseus drew so easily." Antinous, saving himself for last, suggested they postpone the contest until tomorrow, after making proper sacrifices to Apollo, the god of archery. The others agreed, relieved to have an excuse for their failure. It was then that Odysseus spoke from his corner. "Noble lords, might a beggar try his luck with the bow? I was strong once, before suffering broke me. Let me see if any of that strength remains." The hall erupted in laughter. A beggar touching the bow, competing with them? Antinous threatened to have him shipped off to King Echetus, who cut off men's noses and ears for sport. But Penelope intervened. "The stranger is my guest. He obviously cannot marry me, even if he succeeds. But if he strings the bow, I'll give him new clothes and safe passage anywhere he wishes to go." Telemachus then stood, playing his part perfectly. "Mother," he said firmly, "the bow is mine by inheritance. I alone decide who may try it. This is no longer your concern. Go to your chamber with your women and tend to your weaving. The bow is men's business now, and mine above all, for I am master in this house." Penelope stared at her son in shock. He had never spoken to her this way before, never claimed his authority so forcefully. The suitors, too, were surprised. The boy they had mocked was suddenly speaking like a king. She opened her mouth to protest, then closed it, her years of wisdom telling her that something had changed, though she didn't know what. With a long, searching look at the beggar, then at her son, she turned and climbed the stairs to her chamber. As soon as she had gone, Eumaeus picked up the bow and began carrying it towards Odysseus. The suitors shouted threats, demanding he put it down. Telemachus countered with threats of his own. In the confusion, Eumaeus reached Odysseus and placed the bow in his hands. At the same moment, Phaeacians quietly barred the doors. Part 18. The Suitors. Odysseus held his bow for the first time in 20 years. He turned it slowly, examining every inch, checking for worm damage or rot. The suitors laughed, mocking him for examining it like a merchant appraising goods. Then, as easily as a musician strings a lyre, Odysseus strung the great bow. The suitors' laughter died. He plucked the string, and it made a clear, sharp sound that vibrated through the hall. Outside, thunder rumbled overhead as Zeus showed his approval. Still seated on his stool, Odysseus fitted an arrow to the string. He drew, aimed, and released. The arrow, just as he had intended, flew true through all 12 axe rings before burying itself in the far wall. "The feast ends," Odysseus said as he rose to his feet. "Time now for a different sport." Before anyone could move, before anyone could speak, he had another arrow nocked. This one flew straight into Antinous' throat, just as the man lifted a golden cup to his lips. Blood poured into the wine, and Antinous toppled backward, his feet kicking over the table as he died. Confusion erupted through the hall. The suitors leapt up, searching the walls where weapons should hang, finding only empty pegs. Telemachus had done his work well. They had nothing but their eating knives and whatever swords they carried.
"You'll die for this!" Eurymachus shouted. "You've killed the greatest noble in Ithaca!"
In answer, Odysseus stripped away his beggar's rags, revealing himself in full.
"Dogs! You thought I'd never return from Troy. You consumed my wealth, abused my servants, and courted my wife while I still lived. You feared neither gods nor men. Today you learn the price of that arrogance."
Terror drained the colour from every face. Eurymachus stumbled forward, hands spread as he tried to bargain, to blame the dead Antinous, to promise repayment for all they had consumed. His speech ended when Odysseus put an arrow through his chest. The man collapsed across the feasting table, his sword spinning away across the floor. What followed was pandemonium. Some suitors ran for the doors and found them barred fast. Others scrambled for the empty weapon pegs, unable to believe they held nothing. Tables were overturned to serve as shields. Men shouted orders that no one followed. Those with swords drew them, but in the confined space, surrounded by panicking bodies, they could barely move. Odysseus stood at his vantage point, shooting arrow after arrow. Each shot found its mark. Men fell clutching their throats, their chests, their bellies. Bodies began to pile near the exits as the desperate tried to escape. While his father continued his work, Telemachus slipped away to the storeroom. He returned with armour and spears for Odysseus, Eumaeus, and Phaeacians, with the four of them standing together, properly armed at last. But the goat-herd Melanthius had also found his way to that storeroom. Loyal to the suitors who had fed him well, he managed to bring swords and spears to some of them before Eumaeus and Phaeacians caught him making a second trip. They bound him tight and hauled him up to the rafters, leaving him hanging there for later judgment. When Odysseus's arrows were spent, 30 suitors lay dead, but 70 still lived. Now they had weapons, though they remained trapped in the hall. The suitors, desperate, threw spears in organized volleys, but Athena appeared, disguised as Mentor yet again, deflecting their weapons with a flick of her wrist. When Odysseus and his 3 companions threw their spears in return, every one found its mark. The suitors regrouped for one final charge, but Athena chose that moment to unleash her full divine power. Rising above them, she unfurled her aegis, the golden shield adorned with Medusa's horrific face. The suitors' minds shattered at the sight, panic consuming them utterly. They ran without purpose or direction, some falling to their knees, others trampling the wounded in their frenzy to escape. What followed was a massacre. Odysseus and his 3 companions moved through the hall without mercy. Every stroke found flesh, every thrust ended a life as blood pooled on the marble floor. Amidst the chaos, Leodes the priest fell to his knees and clasped Odysseus's legs, begging for mercy. He swore he had never touched a serving woman, that he had tried to restrain the other's worst excesses. Odysseus brought his sword down without hesitation, the priest's head rolling away, his lips still moving in a silent plea. Only 2 were spared, Phemius the bard and Medon the herald, and only because Telemachus vouched that they had served under compulsion, not choice. Then it was finished. The great hall stood silent, but for blood dripping from the walls and table edges. Bodies lay everywhere, piled like fish hauled onto a beach. Odysseus stood in their midst, drenched in gore, his chest heaving, the fury of 20 years finally spent. He called for old Euryclea. When she entered and saw the slaughter, She raised her voice to sing in triumph, but Odysseus cut her short. "No celebration over the dead," he said. "These men were destroyed by fate and their own wickedness. Now tell me, which of the servant women betrayed this house?" 12 maids had taken the suitors as lovers, mocking Penelope and dishonouring the household. Odysseus had them brought to clean the hall, to carry out the bodies of the men they had embraced. They wept as they worked, scrubbing blood from the floors and walls. After the hall was cleaned, Telemachus marched them to the courtyard. "You don't deserve a clean death," he said, remembering their cruelty to his mother. He denied them the quick death of a blade. Instead, he strung them up from a rope stretched between 2 pillars, sending them to join their lovers in the underworld. For Melanthius, a crueler fate awaited. They dragged him down from the rafters and into the courtyard, where justice would be served for his treachery. They removed his extremities one by one, first his hands that had armed the suitors, then his feet that had run to betray his master. They left him bleeding in the dirt, to contemplate his choices as his life ebbed away. Finally, Odysseus had the hall purified with burning sulphur. As the smoke cleared, loyal servants emerged from their hiding places. When they recognized their true king beneath the blood and grime, they fell upon him weeping, kissing his hands and face. Odysseus wept with them, overcome by their faithfulness, they who had remained true through 20 years of suffering. Part 19. Penelope. Euryclea ran to Penelope's chamber, where Athena had made sure that the queen slept through the slaughter. "Wake up, my lady!" the old nurse cried. "He's home! Odysseus is home! He's killed them all, every last suitor!" Penelope sat up slowly, her face sceptical. "Dear nurse, have the gods driven you mad? Why do you mock me with such cruel lies?" "It's true! The beggar was Odysseus all along. I saw the scar when I washed his feet, but he made me keep silent. Come and see." Even when Penelope came down and saw Odysseus sitting by the fire, no longer the aged beggar, but a man in his prime, though still covered in blood, she held back. She sat opposite him, staring at his face in the firelight, saying nothing. "Mother," Telemachus said impatiently, "your husband is home after 20 years, and you sit there like a stone? What other woman would be so hard-hearted?" "If this is truly Odysseus," Penelope said carefully, "he and I will know each other. We have signs between us that no one else knows." Odysseus smiled slightly. "Let her be, son. She's right to test me. I'll bathe and put on clean clothes. Then we'll speak." When he returned, washed and dressed in royal robes, looking like a king again with Athena's help, Penelope still held back. She studied him for a long moment, then turned to the old nurse. "Euryclea," she said calmly, "move his great bed out of our bedchamber. Set it up for him elsewhere, with fine blankets and fleeces." "Move our bed?" Odysseus's composure shattered. He shot to his feet, his voice rising in disbelief. "What do you mean, move it? Who has dared to enter our chamber? That bed cannot be moved. I built it myself around the living olive tree. I shaped the trunk into the bedpost while it still grew from the earth, raised the room around it, inlaid the frame with gold and silver and ivory. To move that bed, one would have to cut through the tree itself.
Tell me, Penelope, has someone destroyed it? Has someone defiled our chamber?"
Penelope's face transformed with joy. "Odysseus," she cried, running to him, throwing her arms around his neck. "My husband, forgive me. I had to be sure. So many impostors have come claiming your name. Only the true Odysseus could know the secret of our marriage bed." They held each other, crying, neither able to let go. 20 years of separation, of loneliness, of doubt and fear and stubborn hope, all of it poured forth as they clung together. Penelope traced his weathered features with trembling fingers, finding beneath the new lines and scars the man she had married. Odysseus buried his face in her hair, breathing in her familiar scent, feeling her tears warm against his neck, knowing that he had found, at last, what Troy and all the seas had kept from him. He was home. They talked through the night, sharing their stories. Odysseus told her everything, the wanderings, the monsters, the gods, the losses. She told him of her tricks to delay the suitors, how she had woven Laertes' funeral shroud by day and unravelled it by night for 3 years, how she had never wavered in her faith that he would return, even when all of Ithaca declared him dead. As dawn approached, Athena held back the sunrise, extending the darkness as her gift to the couple who had endured so much. In their bed, built around the olive tree, the bed that could never be moved, Odysseus and Penelope found each other again, and for those precious hours, the rest of the world fell away. In the days that followed, Odysseus restored order to his kingdom. He made peace with the families of the slain suitors, guided by Athena's wisdom to prevent the cycle of vengeance from continuing. Old Laertes lived to see his son take his rightful place on the throne, and though Tiresias had prophesied one final journey that Odysseus must undertake in his old age, a journey inland with an oar on his shoulder, until he found people who knew nothing of the sea, that tale belonged to the distant future. For now, the war was truly over. The wandering had ended. The king and queen of Ithaca ruled together once more, their love having survived the ultimate test of 20 years apart. And so ends the Odyssey, the story of Odysseus, the man of many troubles, who saw the cities of many men and learned their minds, who suffered greatly on the seas, and who proved that neither gods nor monsters, nor time itself, could keep a determined heart from finding its way home. For 3,000 years, his story has been told wherever people gather, wherever ships sail, wherever wanderers seek their way back to those who wait for them. The journey of Odysseus had ended at last. But his story, like all great stories, will never truly end. I've been David Rintoul for Deep Dive History. If you've enjoyed our retelling of the Odyssey and want to find out what happens to Odysseus next, his adventures, his fate, and his tragic death, then join our channel membership and watch our bonus episode, The End of Odysseus. And while you're there, check out our entire catalogue of bonus content. Here we have exclusive stories, bonus episodes, and interviews with professors and industry experts. From a 2-hour epic retelling of Jason and the Argonauts to a deep dive on Homer and the authors of Greek mythology, access it all by joining the channel membership today.